A map drawn in candlelight. Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. The only place where ancient royal blunders and half-finished maps are oddly soothing and just boring enough to help you drift into the softest sleep. Tonight, we're going back in time to a moment before America was America, before highways, before Wi-Fi, before breakfast cereals and baseball, back when oceans were wide, ships were wooden, and powerful kings divided the world with ink, candles, and utter overconfidence. You're in a cold stone room, not as majestic as stories tell it, but silent, with faint echoes of leather boots on the floor and the rustling of parchment unfurling. You can almost hear the stiff collars creak as monarchs from Europe's France, England, and the Netherlands gather around a flickering candlelit table, their faces lit unevenly like characters in a very slow, very sleepy play. There's no breeze, only the scent of beeswax and damp stone. The map before them is grand, but it's wrong, wildly wrong. It has mountains where there are none, rivers flowing in loops, and coastlines that look like someone described them from a dream. But none of that matters to these kings, because in their world, declaring ownership is just a matter of saying it out loud with enough silk on your shoulders. The Spanish king points to a scribbled bay and mutters something about divine right. The French king gestures at a river he's never seen, calling it his by virtue of taste and elegance. The English king simply says, "We'll take this," his voice as dry as the map itself. Nobody notices the irony. You're watching history being invented with guesses and goblets of wine. Every king speaks with quiet confidence about forests they've never touched, people they've never met, and weather they've never endured. Their fingers slide over paper hills and drawn in cities that don't exist. They name places New Spain, New France, New Amsterdam, and New England, as if the addition of new magically makes them theirs. Outside, the actual forests of America, vast, damp, buzzing with life, remain unbothered, unchanged. An unconquered deer walk silently past trees hundreds of years old, while these kings debate how best to divide it all. Believing the map is the land and the ink is truth, you lean against the stone wall, invisible in the corner, as one king yawns and another adjusts his velvet robes. No one in the room has dirt under their nails or has ever slept under the stars. The candles flicker again. The map glows golden, and then dims. The servants quietly refilled goblets and nod at commands they've heard before. But you know something they don't, that these kings will never tame the forest, and that their flags, once planted, will rot just like old wood. You start to drift now, lulled by the slow absurdity of it all. The room grows heavier with talk of ships, decrees, charters, and colonies. Nobody in the room will ever step foot in the lands they so eagerly divide. And as your eyes begin to close, you find it strangely comforting to know that the trees they claimed have never read a map, and that no crown, however golden, can keep its place in a world where forests have the final say. Spain licks the shoreline. It starts with a salt, the kind of salt that rides on Atlantic winds and creeps into the wood of ships long before they even leave the docks. The kind of salt that whispers of distant lands and promises to grant it. Question: you are standing not in America but in the quiet, echoing court of Spain, where the air is thick with incense and the heavy drapery of royal ambition. The year is somewhere between certainty and fantasy, in that fuzzy glow of the 16th century, when monarchs sat on her-backed thrones and believed the world could be redrawn with ink and confidence. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella have already tasted the thrill of sending ships into the blue unknown, and now their hunger grows. They look westward, toward a continent neither of them will ever see, and decide it belongs to them, not part of it, not a piece they might manage, no, all of it. From the sun-scorched islands of the Caribbean to the swampy coastlines of what they would later call Florida. It all becomes, at least in their minds, a jewel to be plucked, a territory to be baptized in the name of crown and cross. You watch as ships are built, not in silence, but in a constant clatter of hammer on timber, of sailors cursing the weight of barrels, of captains memorizing orders they will soon discard. The sails are stiff and white, the hulls slick with fresh tar on board. The men carry armor, muskets, Bibles, and hope so thick it smells of oranges and metal. When they arrive on distant shores, the welcome is not always hostile, nor is it always warm. It is simply different. They step onto the soft sands of places they cannot name, meet people they do not understand, and still they declare, almost instinctively, that all they see is Spanish now. With every footstep in land, they carry the weight of the crown on their backs. They build forts that are eaten by the jungle before the next moon rises. They light candles in makeshift chapels, while rain seeps through the roof. The land is humid and alive, pulsing with insects, thick with the scent of crushed leaves and unfamiliar flowers. You can almost hear the buzz in the air, like a soft warning, but they press on. Reports sent back to the crown described lush landscapes and endless bounty. But between the lines you can read the confusion. Where is the gold? Why do the rivers not match the maps? Why does the rain never stop? Yet they continue, naming everything with the same rhythm. Santa this, San that, Nueva, these, and el Espíritu Santo that. Names fall upon the land like a thin layer of royal frosting over an earth that does not care. Sometimes entire cities are declared before a single structure is built. Back in Spain, the monarchs smile at letters sealed in red wax, not knowing that the settlement described is already collapsed, its wooden beams now part of the undergrowth. You walk now beside a group of soldiers trudging through ankle-deep water, their muskets held high and their tempers lower than their rations. One of them mutters a prayer, another curses the mud that pulls at his boots. They are chasing rumors of a golden city, El Dorado perhaps, or maybe something else entirely no one can remember. The jungle wraps around them like a wet blanket, slow and unyielding. They fire at birds, at shadows, at the fear that maybe there is no empire waiting to be claimed. A priest among them tries to sing a hymn but is drowned out by frogs. They set up camp in a clearing where the mosquitoes are thick enough to darken the sky. Someone carves a cross into a tree. Another plants a flag that sags almost instantly. You keep walking, farther inland, past places now called Florida, Georgia, the Gulf Coast, where forts were sketched on maps with precise lines but never rose from the earth. The dreams of kings don't build walls. They merely hope someone else will. In one settlement, the men argue over whether to follow the river or stay put. They choose poorly. Within a week, half are sick, and the rest are silently carving canoes. The ships that once carried them proudly from Seville now feel like distant ghosts, yet the reports sent back to court remain hopeful. Progress is being made, they write, though no one can say what that progress is. Spain, far away and deeply proud, continues to assign governors to places without roads, bishops to congregations that do not exist, and taxes to citizens who have never heard of the crown. Meanwhile, the real America, the one of tangled roots and endless stars, goes on. You sit beneath a canopy of trees that have no interest in politics. Around you, the land breathes in the quiet way that ancient places do. A river glides by, its surface broken only by a slow-moving turtle. Somewhere in the distance, drums echo faintly, not of war, but of ceremony, of rhythm older than kingdoms. Spain has licked the shoreline with its banners and bronze, but it has not entered the heart. It cannot. You think now of the men who stood on ships' prows, pointing proudly at a misty coastline and declaring it conquered. You remember how they measured land in leagues and promises, in saints' names and shiplogs. Yet when the tide comes in, the flagpole leans, and when the wind shifts, even the name fades. Colonies come and go. Some last a season, others a generation. Forts crumble, parchments yellow, but the land remembers the softness of the original silence. The deeper the Spanish dig, the more the roots push back. Still, they try, they send. More expeditions, more missionaries, more maps. Each new attempt adds another chapter to a story that never quite reaches the ending. And now, as your eyes begin to close, you hear not the anthem of empire but the rustle of leaves, the hush of waves retreating from the sand, the slow exhale of a jungle untouched by royal decree. Spain may have licked the shoreline, but the continent remains vast, indifferent, and beautifully unmoved. France sends furs and faith. The air grows colder now, not with the chill of failure, but with the quiet determination of a new empire stepping onto the stage, wrapped not in the roar of drums but in the soft rustle of velvet and the whisper of incense drifting through stone cathedrals where stained glass windows paint halos on explorers' brows and kings speak of destiny in the measured tones of practiced certainty. And this time the voice belongs to France, a nation that sees the new world not as a stage for immediate conquest but as a canvas for trade, spirituality, and dreams dipped in river mist and smoked with the musk of beaver pelts. For where Spain, who had chased gold and thunder, France sought furs and faith, and the kings who signed the papers knew little of the cold beyond their gardens, but they imagined America as a place of cathedral spires and fur-lined mantles, of snowy forests tamed by holy words and commerce. And so they sent their men sailors, traders, priests across the Atlantic with ships stocked not only with supplies but with catechisms, rosaries, muskets, and hopeful silence. And these men, the first emissaries of France's colonial spirit, did not land with rows of soldiers in shining armor but with quiet resolve and the cautious steps of those who knew they were guests in a land that could not be easily claimed. So they entered from the north, winding through the St. Lawrence River like ghosts whispering in the fog, their canoes gliding past pine-dark shores and jagged cliffs. And with them came the soft sound of Latin prayers, mixing with the cry of loons and the splash of paddles against icy water. And you find yourself among them now, wrapped in layers of wool, the scent of damp leather and fish oil clinging to everything. And the cold is not cruel but patient, seeping into your bones with the quiet discipline of winter. And as they reach inland, these French explorers and missionaries do not build grand cities but trading posts, missions, and way stations where furs are bartered for tools, and stories pass between languages like smoke through cracks in a cabin wall. And everywhere they go they name the land with gentler hands, calling rivers Rivière du Loup or Sainte-Marie and lakes Lac Saint-Jean, and they sketch maps that curl at the edges and leave blank spaces with only suggestions of mountains and trees. Because this empire is built not on swift conquest but slow immersion, one fur trade agreement at a time, one whispered baptism in a forest chapel lit by animal fat lamps. And the priests, often barefoot, write long letters home about conversions and kindness and the unimaginable vastness of the land, and they describe snow not as obstacle but as blessing, muffling the noise of ambition. And they speak of native peoples with a mix of admiration, ignorance, and the uneasy conviction that salvation lies only through their faith, even as they depend on those same communities for survival. And as the French settle more deeply, they learn to build long narrow boats and wear moccasins, and they adapt their customs in small ways, eating wild rice and smoking fish. And they carve out an identity not entirely French and not entirely native but something in between, a hybrid shaped by birch bark and devotion. And while the kings in Versailles believe they are planting a mirror of France, what grows instead is New France, a place where the cold sculpts everything and where every chapel stands beside a trading hut, where every rosary hangs beside a musket, and the land listens, mostly impassively, to the low hum of these new visitors. For while Spain had stamped its presence loudly and England would soon build with squares and fences, France drifted through the trees like snow, leaving behind wooden crosses, journals, and trails worn into the ground by generations of soft-footed steps. And you walk now beside a Jesuit named Pierre, who is writing by the dim light of a pine torch, his Latin scroll hurried but precise as he describes the stars above the St. Maurice River. And he believes this work, this effort to bring faith to what he calls a wild place, is a holy mission. But he is also tired, and his hands are cracked from the cold. And when he finishes his letter he folds it with care, not knowing that it will take 9 months to reach France, and that by the time it arrives, the bishop who assigned him will already have died of fever. But it does not matter, because Pierre will keep writing, and the traders will keep trading, and the rhythm of New France will continue like a lullaby hummed through snow-laden trees. And nearby in a different post, a man named Jacques is weighing beaver pelts, stacking them neatly in bundles that smell of river and forest. And he jokes with his native partners in a halting mix of French and Algonquin, and they laugh together at the absurdities of supply lines and the mystery of French cheese. And around them, the wilderness leans in closer, not hostile, not welcoming, simply watching. And as the French crown extends its reach deeper into what will become Canada, Louisiana, and the Mississippi Basin, it does so through these quiet agents, these men of fur and faith, who do not draw swords but maps, who do not build cities but networks, and who leave behind not ruins but relationships. And as you follow their path southward along the Mississippi, the trees begin to change and the air grows thicker, and you pass through bayous and muddy banks, past fields that will one day hold plantations but for now lie quiet under the gaze of herons. And still the French come, naming everything they see, wrapping it in syllables like New Orleans and Baton Rouge and Terrebonne, and they build forts with names like Fort Rosalie and Fort Prudhomme, each one a tiny anchor in the slow current of empire. And still they send letters, and still they record baptisms, and still they trade pelts for powder, blankets for beads, faith for trust. And though their settlements are fragile and scattered, they endure longer than expected, not because they conquer but because they adapt. And you rest now by the edge of a frozen stream, the air so still that your breath hangs like glass, and you think of all the men who pass this way, moving through silence, chasing a vision of empire shaped not by thunder but by whispers. And as your eyes begin to close, lulled by the soft rhythm of paddles dipping into black water, you understand why France sent furs and faith, and why the land accepted them more gently than flags or swords. For in the end, the forest prefers quiet things. England's muddy footprint, the mist settles low across the marshes now, curling like a sleepy sigh around wooden planks nailed hastily into docks that creak under the weight of hopeful feet and damp barrels filled with moldy bread, rusted tools, and too many silver spoons but not enough shovels. And as you step ashore with the first English settlers, you find yourself ankle-deep in mud that sucks at your boots like a hungry animal, reminding you with each squelch that no charter, no matter how royal it's sealed, can prepare a man for a world of mosquitoes, hunger, and the eerie sounds of frogs calling in a language older than crowns. For unlike Spain's brash claim or France's soft whisper, England's arrival is clumsy, noisy, and underfed, shaped less by divine purpose and more by annoying restlessness that pushes men to leave behind debts, reputations, and overcrowded London alleys in favor of a rumor called Virginia, a place so vaguely described and so poorly understood that its promise lives more in imagination than in any practical plan. And so they come, these Englishmen with their hats too tall and their supplies too few, carrying muskets and inkpots and the full weight of a king's hopes in their brittle fingers. And they name the place Jamestown, after the very king who sent them, as if the act of naming it might protect them from the fever hiding in the brackish water or the lean wolves in the trees. And they build quickly, not because they are skilled but because they are desperate, hammering together forts with uneven logs and roofs that leak before the first rain even falls. And they speak of trade but bring trinkets, they promise peace but fire muskets too soon. And they pray for salvation while hoarding spoiled meat and arguing over who gets to sleep closest to the fire. And you stand among them now, watching as they squint into the forest, unsure whether the shadows they see are trees or people or something worse. And the days stretch long with labor, while the nights are filled with coughs, scratching rats, and the creaking sound of makeshift walls shifting under wind. And though they try to pretend they are building England anew, the truth is this version is soggy, fragile, and faintly absurd, for the rules they bring, property, parliament, propriety, melt like butter in the swampy heat, and even the idea of Englishness begins to warp in the firelight as their clothes fade. Their accents bend, and their manners retreat in favor of simply surviving. And back home, the court speaks proudly of this foothold, this noble effort to bring civilization to the new world, but they do not smell the rot. They do not see the bloated bodies that float by in the river. They do not know that a man once ate his own boots in winter and considered it the best meal he'd had in weeks. And as you follow the years forward, you see how England's presence, though muddied, grows anyway. Stubborn as weeds in spring, fueled not by grace but by grit, for more ships arrive, and with them more settlers and Puritans, some adventurers, some criminals, all clinging to a paper promise of land, liberty, or at least a fresh start. And they spread along the coast like ink on wet paper, smudging borders and stumbling into territories they do not understand, naming everything in honor of places they left behind: New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, as if geography were a wound they could not let heal. And in time they build towns, wooden and wonky but standing, with churches that double as meeting halls and stalks planted proudly in the village square. And they teach their children letters before farming, and they appoint councils and argue about taxes even while wolves prowl the edges of their fields. And you walk among them in a town that smells of damp wool and chimney smoke, where the muddy roads never dry and every building leans slightly, as if tired from holding up so many expectations. And the people speak in a clipped fast rhythm, their mouths full of complaints and convictions. And yet, despite the chaos, something begins to take root, for unlike Spain's gold or France's grace, England brings an obsession with rules, with order, with structure, however poorly implemented, on this stubborn belief that land must be tamed, fenced, measured, and monetized. And so they divide, they plant, they document, and though they argue constantly, they endure. And soon enough a merchant in London sells tobacco from Virginia, and a pamphlet in Oxford describes the savage beauty of the New World with just enough exaggeration to recruit more dreamers. And slowly the coastline transforms, clearing with each passing year, each burned tree, each new row of crude houses that try to stand in straight lines. And yet, for all their effort, the mud remains, creeping into basements, tugging at skirts, never quite forgotten, as if to remind them that this land was never England, no matter how many names they gave it. And you pause now beside a field newly cleared by aching hands, where the soil is rich but unforgiving, and a man named Thomas stands over a grave he dug that morning for his wife, who died from a fever he cannot name. And he wipes his brow, mutters a prayer that mixes scripture with something older, and walks back to his hut, where a child cries and stew boils without meat. And as the wind rustles through trees that have seen empires come and go, you understand that England's muddy footprint is not elegant or even deliberate. but it is persistent, a slow crawl rather than a march, a series of half-successes and quiet recoveries that somehow accumulate into permanence, and by the time the next ship arrives, carrying new laws and fresh linen and letters from a king who will never see these shores, the colony stands a little taller, its mud now trampled into paths, its forts patched, its graves marked, and its people tired, bitten and burned, no longer just English but something new, something muddied by the land, shaped by storms and softened by failure. And as your eyes begin to close, lulled by the soft chirp of crickets and the gentle flap of linen hung to dry, you think of how conquest is not always a shout, sometimes it is a murmur repeated enough times to echo, and how even muddy footprints, stepped carefully over time, can lead to cities. The forgotten Dutch and the purchase that wasn't it begins with a breeze off the Hudson River, not the kind that carries grandeur or triumph, but one that drifts through reeds and rattles the thatched roofs of early settlements with a sleepy indifference, and as it brushes past your cheek, you find yourself standing among people who are rarely remembered yet once dreamed as boldly as kings. The Dutch, with their tall ships, practical boots, and merchant eyes that saw not gold or glory but trade, efficiency, and quietly profitable order. And while Spain marched in with banners and France floated on canoes, and England tripped over its own rules, the Dutch simply arrived, looked around, and started writing receipts, for theirs was a world of ledgers, of contracts, of neat columns filled with florins and floral. And so they landed not with fanfare but with focus, and they built New Amsterdam, a name more businesslike than romantic, on the southern tip of an island that glistened with promise and possibility, not because it looked like heaven, but because it looked like something that could be organized, taxed, and traded. And you walk now through this early Dutch world, a place of brick houses and wooden stoops, of barrels stacked in perfect rows, and of narrow, muddy lanes where chickens wander freely and men haggle over beaver pelts with the same seriousness they might argue about a will. And at the heart of it all stands a simple story, retold so many times that it has become more myth than memory: the purchase of Manhattan, an island traded, supposedly, for trinkets worth $24, a tale that has floated down centuries like a dandelion seed on the wind, soft and slightly ridiculous, and yet it lingers, an emblem of the era's lopsided understanding of land, value, and power for what the Dutch considered a legal transaction. The local Lenape saw as something closer to a gesture of shared space, a kind of mutual permission rather than a permanent sale. And you watch the exchange unfold, not with drama, but with quiet curiosity, beads and cloth offered with friendly gestures, not as payment but as tokens of goodwill. And yet the Dutch wrote it down, sealed it, filed it, and sailed back to their settlement with the confidence of people who believed that a signed paper meant everything, never quite grasping that the earth beneath them did not care for signatures or seals. And as the years pass, New Amsterdam grows in fits and starts, not with the surging ambition of empires but with the slow, practical rhythm of merchants planting cabbage, building windmills, and trading tobacco, furs, and timber with anyone who would bargain fairly. And unlike their European cousins, the Dutch seem content with variety, welcoming settlers from many nations, embracing multiple tongues, and permitting worship of different faiths with a tolerance rare for the time. And so the streets of their small city echo with Dutch, English, French, and native languages, not in harmony but in daily, ordinary noise. And it is this openness that gives New Amsterdam its distinct flavor, not mighty, not mythic, but stubbornly human. And yet for all their industriousness, the Dutch live in the shadow of larger ambitions, and you begin to feel the pressure as English ships linger in nearby harbors, their captains watching like foxes outside a henhouse, waiting not to fight, but to inherit. And the Dutch, perhaps too fond of rules and contracts, do not prepare for the day when a simple letter from an English duke will change the island's name without spilling a drop of blood. For when the moment comes, in 1664, the Dutch surrender New Amsterdam without a siege, without a burning city, but with a shrug and a sigh. And suddenly the island belongs to England, renamed New York in honor of the Duke who never even saw it. And the city shifts slightly, its stoops still the same, its docks still crowded, but its flag changed like a curtain pulled between acts. And you walk now along those same muddy streets, the smell of herring and horses in the air, the sound of bells marking hours for merchants still doing what they always did: trading, living, building, not because of who ruled them but despite it. And even as English customs seep in, even as street names begin to change and taxes are rerouted to London, the Dutch habits remain quiet and resilient. shaping the future without needing to control it. And it is this strange legacy, the invisible architecture beneath the louder walls of empire, that lingers. For though the Dutch would lose the colony, their sense of tolerance, of contracts, of civic order would echo long after their flag came down, embedded in the bones of a city that would grow to be vast, unruly, and endlessly reinvented. And as you step out onto a dock lit by the pale orange of a setting sun, you listen to the lapping water and the creak of ropes straining against moorings, and you realize that while most remember kings and battles, there is a strange comfort in the idea that some empires trade in paperwork instead of power, in civility rather than conquest, and that their influence, though quieter, runs deeper through the things we take for granted: grid streets, free press, property rights, and the belief that cities are not owned, but built, person by person, barrel by barrel, stoop by stoop. And as your eyes begin to close, soothed by the gentle clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the faint scent of pipe smoke drifting from an open window, you understand that sometimes the history we forget is the history that holds us up, quietly, patiently, like the foundation stones of a house whose builders are long gone but whose shape remains strong against the shifting winds of time. The colonies that weren't, lost dreams in forgotten soil. There is something haunting about maps drawn with certainty over lands never seen, lines etched with ambition and labeled with royal flair, and yet, when you trace them today, the names echo faintly, if at all. Ghost towns of ink, ambitions turned to ash, and hopes left to sink beneath marsh, forest, and time. And as you step into this quieter history, the one not found in triumphs but in attempts, you begin to sense the rhythm of failure that undergirded the colonial push into the New World. Not just the well-known settlements that flourished, but the many that never stood a chance. Colonies whispered into existence in the minds of financiers, scribbled onto charters by secretaries in velvet sleeves, and approved by kings who never intended to visit, and yet they were real, at least for a moment. A campfire lit in a clearing, a wooden sign hammered into place, a prayer whispered into foreign winds, and then loans, the kind of silence that swallows footsteps and shrouds the years like moss on forgotten stones. And you find yourself now standing on a stretch of land that once bore the name Fort Caroline, founded by the French in 1564 near what is now Jacksonville, Florida. An attempted Huguenots' refuge in the swamplands of Spain's ambition, and the settlers came, full of hope and weary of persecution, carrying with them psalms, plows, and fragile dreams of freedom. And they built quickly, fearing the Spanish would find them, which they did, ruthlessly. And within a year the fort was overrun, its defenders killed, its buildings burned, and its name lost to the centuries. And all that remains now are hints in the soil. French coins found in the roots of cypress trees, and a faint outline of walls where weeds now grow. And from there you are pulled north to Popham Colony, England's forgotten twin to Jamestown, founded in 1607 in present-day Maine, a site chosen for its river access and high ground, but cursed by bitter winters, poor leadership, and internal conflict. And the settlers, overwhelmed and underprepared, abandoned it after just a year. Their wooden church left to rot, their plans crumpled like the smoke from their last campfire. And it's strange to think that for a brief time, England had two beginnings in America, and only one took root, while the other was erased not by battle, but by cold and disappointment. And as you walk among these places, you begin to realize just how fragile every colony once was, not just because of hostile terrain or disease or local resistance, but because of distance, the sheer impossibility of maintaining supply lines and morale across an ocean when letters took months. Storms claimed ships, and memory itself began to blur between departure and return. And then there's the infamous Roanoke, the lost colony, carved into the American mythos with the single word Croatoan left behind as its only trace. A settlement that disappeared without blood or fire, just a vanishing act performed by the wilderness itself, perhaps absorbed into native communities, perhaps destroyed by hunger or fear or longing for home. And it leaves behind more questions than answers. A quiet monument to how uncertain everything once was, and how much could vanish without a trace, when the land refused to bend, and the people had no more strength to push. And you sit now in one of those forgotten clearings, the sun dappling through branches overhead, the grass waving softly in a breeze that has passed through centuries. And the quiet feels deeper here, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of what once was, of voices that once sang hymns, and argued over rations and worried about whether their sponsors back in Europe would send more grain or more muskets. And even as they built palisades and planted crops, they must have felt the weight of being small in a vast land that did not care about their charters or titles. and their names Popham Darien, Fort San Juan, Fort Nassau half become whispers, kept alive only by historians and footnotes, and yet in their failure lies something strangely human, not tragic, not foolish, but deeply relatable for these were people who tried, who believed in something far away and risked everything for it, and though their dreams crumbled, their attempts shaped the boundaries of what would eventually come, if not through their hands, then through the lessons learned from their missteps. And the forest remembers, even when we do not, for beneath the roots of pine and oak lie rusted tools, buttons, fragments of bowls, and the bones of camps that once echoed with laughter and fear and planning. And you rise and wander toward a nearby inlet, the water calm, the reeds swaying like a slow metronome, and you imagine the ships that once anchored here, smaller than you'd think, bobbing gently as crews offloaded barrels and hopes onto damp, unfamiliar soil. And it's hard not to feel the echo of their footsteps as you walk, hard not to feel the quiet respect for their courage even when it failed. And as twilight settles in and the world turns soft around the edges, you find comfort not in the success of empires but in the humanity of attempts, in the way these forgotten colonies held light for a time, flickered bravely, and then faded, and that, too, as a kind of history worth remembering, for while their names were erased from maps, their presence lingers in the shape of how others tried differently, learned from them, and eventually endured. And as your eyes begin to close, lulled by the hush of wind over lost fields and the gentle murmur of time slipping past, you understand that not every failure is the end. Sometimes it is simply a pause between breaths in the long, quiet song of how this continent was slowly, unevenly, and endlessly reshaped. The haunting hunger of winter, starvation and survival in the early colonies, it is not the roar of battle or the pomp of founding ceremonies that defines the true experience of early colonists, but hunger quiet, creeping, and relentless. If the land itself, vast and fertile, though it may seem in hindsight, refused to open its bounty easily to strangers with foreign seeds and unfamiliar prayers. And nowhere does this feel more chilling than in the long winters that followed each hopeful summer, when food stores dwindled, livestock died, rivers froze, and the very walls of shelters creaked with cold and despair. And you now stand in such a place, not amid celebration or discovery, but inside the skeletal framework of a colonial cabin in midwinter, the wind slicing through the cracks in the timber, carrying the bitter smell of smoke, and you hear not the clamor of civilization rising, but the soft, hollow cough of someone starving quietly beside a dying fire. And you look around and see that this is Jamestown in 1609, but it might as well be anywhere Plymouth, Port Royal, St. Croix. For the early years of nearly every European colony on the American continent were defined by brutal seasons of scarcity, when the high ideals of settlement collapsed into the raw instinct of survival. And history tends to smooth over this part, favoring tales of harvest feasts and sturdy pilgrims, but the truth lies in scattered journals, in mass graves, in the whispered confessions of cannibalism scratched into private letters no one was meant to read. And it begins when the ships leave, returning to Europe with hopeful reports and empty hulls, leaving behind small bands of settlers with more ambition than provisions, who plant crops unsuited to the soil, hunt game they do not understand, and fail to store enough for the inevitable cold. And you see them now, pacing their small encampments, as autumn deepens, counting jars of cornmeal, attempting to smoke fish that spoil too fast, salting meat with trembling hands as they argue over how much to ration and who deserves more. And when the first snows come, there is still some laughter, still a belief that rescue or resupply is just a few months away, but time stretches strangely in the cold. And by January, all that remains in the storerooms are brittle beans, weevil-riddled grain, and scraps of leather boiled into soup. And by February, people stop speaking unless necessary, their voices hoarse and their eyes sunken, and they dream of food the way others dream of paradise, describing imaginary feasts in exquisite detail to pass the nights. And you sit now beside a woman holding a child, too still to be sleeping, her hands raw and red, her face drawn. And beside her sits a man who once called himself a gentleman, now wrapped in furs and shame, sharpening a knife with no clear purpose. And in the corners of the room are bones, cracked open for marrow and silence, thick and terrible. And this is not fiction, not exaggeration, but recorded fact, known as the starving time in Jamestown, when nearly 400 settlers were reduced to 60 by spring. When diaries describe eating rats, shoe leather, and eventually corpses, not out of malice, but out of something far worse, necessity. And though modern historians argue over the scale and exact moments of this desperation, the truth is undeniable. Hunger haunted every colony like a slow-moving shadow, and even those that did not descend into such extremes still faced relentless scarcity. And you walk now through Plymouth in the winter of 1621, a place romanticized for its Thanksgiving imagery. Yet, in that first winter, half the settlers died, and the others clung to life with the help of native allies who showed them how to find edible roots, how to build better shelters, how to survive a land they had not yet begun to understand. And that is perhaps the cruelest irony, that the land was not barren, not in itself, but it was unfamiliar, and it refused to yield to arrogance, requiring humility, patience, and an openness to learn from those who had lived with it for generations. And those who did learn survived, while those who did not faded quickly, their names buried beneath snow and silence. And you pause now beside a frozen field, the stalks long dead, the earth hard and unyielding, and you can almost hear the voices of those who stood here centuries ago, wondering if spring would come in time, praying without knowing whether their words would carry beyond the smoke-choked roofs. And they did not die heroically, not always, but slowly, anonymously, one by one. And even those who survived carried the weight of that hunger for the rest of their lives, speaking little of it, remembering too much. And as spring finally arrives in this memory, the sun returning weekly, you watch as the survivors stagger out to rebuild, to plant again, to begin the cycle anew, because that is the story of early colonization, not as it's taught in tidy textbooks, but as it truly unfolded, an endless sequence of trying, failing, learning, and trying again, always under the threat of cold and emptiness. And yet, remarkably, people endured, not because they were stronger than the land, but because they adapted, because they learned to ask for help, because they chose to stay even when every instinct told them to flee. And you rest now beneath the sparse branches of a leafless tree, its bark scarred with age, and you think about how many lives passed through this place, how many stories were never written down, how much struggle is hidden behind every founding date. And as your eyes begin to close, comforted by the distant sound of water dripping from thawing ice, you realize that survival, not conquest, is the quiet foundation of history, and that in those long, forgotten winters, in the cold breath of starving settlers and the quiet bravery of those who endured one more day, the true soul of the early colonies was forged not in speeches or charters, but in the soft, stubborn heartbeat of those who refused to die. The silent bridges, native peoples, and the first awkward handshakes long before. The sails appeared on the horizon like ghosts stitched into the sea, before any musket was fired, treaty signed, or disease unleashed. This land was already just with forests and rivers, but with people, stories, and systems far older than any European crown could imagine. And it is here, in this deep and often overlooked thread of history, that we begin to see not only the fractures of first contact, but the small, quiet moments when things might have gone differently, when hands were offered not as enemies but as tentative neighbors. And as you step into this moment, the world is different, not empty, not wild, not new, but thriving, home to hundreds of nations, each with their own language, governance, and rhythms. And they are not frozen in some mythic past, but fully alive, trading, farming, negotiating, and moving with a complexity that baffles the strangers soon to arrive. For when the Europeans step ashore, they do so under the assumption that this land is theirs for the taking, not realizing that every tree, every trail, every riverbend already belongs to someone. And the first encounters vary as much as the people themselves, some peaceful, some suspicious, some curious, but in nearly every case, the initial contact, it is shaped not by force, but by uncertainty. And you now find yourself standing in the clearing where the Wampanoag people, led by Massasoit, first approached the weary settlers of Plymouth. And it is not a moment of spectacle but of immense restraint, a decision born not of weakness but of calculation. For the Wampanoag have already seen what European diseases can do, already watched their numbers dwindle without battle, and they know that these newcomers may be both dangerous and useful. And so Massasoit sends Tisquinamsquanto, as the English later call him, a man who once crossed the Atlantic in chains, learned English, and returned only to find his village wiped out. And now he becomes the bridge, the translator, the guide, the symbol of a meeting that is more like a delicate truce than a celebration. And the English, starving and unsure, accept the help, and for a time, peace is not only possible, it exists fragile, but real. And you can feel the tension as corn is planted with fish for fertilizer, as hunting techniques are shared, as alliances form not from friendship, but from mutual need. And this is not the only such moment, for up and down the coast and deep into the interior, native nations meet the newcomers with a mixture of caution and hope, offering food, safe passage, local knowledge, not because they are naive, but because they understand diplomacy, understand the power of first impressions. And in places like the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Basin, French traders rely almost entirely on the cooperation of native communities to survive, and the relationships built there are more than transactional. They include marriage, kinship, and real cultural exchange. And yet, as you walk along these early trails of contact, you begin to feel the shifting weight of imbalance. For while native peoples often view these new arrivals as one group among many strange but not supernatural, the Europeans arrive with maps already drawn, with territories claimed in absentia, with the certainty that their presence is not just temporary but ordained. And it is this certainty that slowly corrodes the early handshakes, turning trade into expectation, land sharing into land claiming, and diplomacy into demands. And still, resistance does not always come in the form of war. Sometimes it is in the refusal to move, the insistence on being heard, the quiet replanting of crops in fields declared abandoned by colonial eyes. And as you sit now with a woman from the Powhatan Confederacy in the early 1600s, you hear her describe how the English keep building further in, cutting trees without asking, fencing meadows without understanding that open space does not mean unused. And her frustration is not rage, but sadness, a recognition that the guests she once welcomed now act as if they were always here. And in the far north, the Howdenist Confederacy, what the French and English will later call the Iroquois, crafts a complex web of diplomacy with both sides, playing European powers against each other with a skill born of centuries of intertribal negotiation. And yet even their strategy cannot stop the slow press of settlers who bring not only goods but diseases, laws, and an insatiable hunger for land. And you begin to notice how the language of colonial reports shifts, from allies to savages, from guides to obstacles, as soon as native nations begin to resist or assert their rights. And this linguistic shift is not accidental, but a tool, a way to justify expansion, to erase the humanity of those who once shared food and shelter. And this erasure happens not just in writing, but in space, as native villages are pushed westward, as trails become roads, as treaties are signed with full knowledge that they will be broken. And you walk now past one such treaty meeting, the pageantry of European diplomacy laid thick with flags and drums, while across the table sit native leaders who speak with clarity and calm, fully aware that the ink they spill may mean the loss of their children's lands. And even in the face of betrayal, there remains a grace in their resistance, a refusal to vanish quietly. And this thread weaves through every colonial encounter, a history of presence, persistence, and painful adaptation. And it is a history rarely centered, often footnoted, yet foundational, for without the knowledge, labor, and initial goodwill of native peoples, most European colonies would have collapsed long before they could claim success. And yet the gratitude fades as the generations pass, replaced by myths of empty lands and manifest destinies. And as twilight descends around you, and the crickets begin to sing in languages unchanged for millennia, you begin to see that the bridges once built, however briefly, still matter, and the echoes of those first handshakes, both respectful and reluctant, still ripple through the ground beneath your feet, reminding you that history is not just made by conquest or kings, but by the delicate moments when two people from different worlds choose for a moment to share a fire, a meal, and a fragile piece of trust. Tobacco, sugar, and the terrible arithmetic of profit. There is a scent in the air, now not the gentle drift of pine or the comforting warmth of bread baked on a colonial hearth, but something harsher, sweeter, and unmistakably manufactured, a smell that lingers on the wind like a warning, the sickly sweet perfume of tobacco leaves curing in the sun, of sugarcane boiling into syrup, of wealth drawn from the earth not by gentle hands but by blistered fingers and backs bent under the weight of systems designed not for survival but for surplus, for profit, for empire. And as you step into this moment of colonial growth, you do not enter a story of community and resilience, but of arithmetic cold cruel, an immensely profitable arithmetic where each life becomes a number, each harvest a ledger entry, and every acre a calculated risk measured in blood. And it all begins with the rise of cash crops, those lucrative plants that do not feed but, instead, addict, sweeten, and satisfy distant consumers who will never see the fields in which their luxuries are grown. And in the American colonies, tobacco becomes king, not because it sustains the body, but because it seduces the senses. And you find yourself now in the humid fields of Virginia in the early 1600s, where rows upon rows of tobacco plants stretch toward the horizon, tended not by hopeful settlers with dreams of land ownership, but increasingly by laborers brought in to serve not a family, but a plantation, indentured servants at first. Poor Englishmen who trade years of labor for the promise of land and freedom, though many will die before the contract ends, worn out by the brutal demands of the crop and the punishments of its masters. And tobacco is no easy plant, requiring constant care, weeding, drying, sorting, and packing, and every hand that touches it adds to its value, yet sees little of that wealth, and the obsession grows, fueled by demand in Europe, where smoking becomes a fashionable vice, and investors back in London grow rich on the backs of workers they will never meet. And yet even this system of indenture soon proves too slow, too limited, and too uncertain for those who wish to expand faster, plant more, sell more, and reap more. And so begins one of the darkest turns in colonial history, the rapid rise of African slavery in the Americas, a system that replaces temporary contracts with permanent bondage, one in which people are no longer treated as flawed but free agents, but as property, as capital, as tools whose humanity is stripped away by laws, language, and habit. And you now walk through a different kind of plantation, this one larger, harsher, and more secretive, where the sounds of labor are not just shouts and instructions, but the creak of chains, the crack of whips, and the eerie silence of people who have learned that speaking too freely can mean punishment. And here tobacco is not just a crop, it is a prison, and the arithmetic has changed entirely, for now the value of a harvest is measured not only by the weight of its leaves but by the number of enslaved people forced to tend it, and a man's wealth is counted not in acres alone, but in bodies. And this practice, which begins almost casually, almost experimentally, quickly becomes codified, normalized, and fiercely protected, and not just in Virginia but in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, in the rice fields of South Carolina, in the cotton farms that will rise decades later. And everywhere you turn, profit becomes tied to pain in a system so vast and enduring that it shapes the entire structure of the colonial economy. And yet back in Europe, none of this is visible, only the end product: fine sugar in porcelain dishes, smooth tobacco smoked in silver pipes, rum poured into crystal glasses, all symbols of wealth and modernity, all purchased with a deliberate ignorance of their origins. And the colonists who benefit justify the system with language that twists scripture, science, and politics into tools of oppression, declaring the enslaved inferior by nature, suited to servitude, grateful even. And thus the arithmetic is not just physical, but moral, a calculation that allows people to sleep at night while others are whipped into fields at dawn. And yet, despite this overwhelming brutality, resistance pulses beneath the surface like a heartbeat, quiet, persistent, and defiant. Enslaved people who steal moments of rest, who teach their children forbidden stories, who run, who rebel, who endure, and their stories, though often lost in the smoke of burning records or buried in anonymous graves, remain the most powerful reminder that even in systems built to dehumanize, the human spirit refuses to be entirely extinguished. And you now sit by a river at dusk, watching as the sun sinks behind fields of green that wave gently in the breeze. And it is a beautiful sight until you remember the labor behind it, the generations of lives consumed so that others might profit. And the weight of that memory settles over the landscape like a fog, not erasing its beauty, but demanding that it be seen in full, not just as a postcard of pastoral success, but as a ledger of loss. And yet even here, in this most painful part of colonial history, there are nuances to hold, for not every person complicit in the system understood its full cruelty, and not every person trapped within it was defeated by it. And the story is not one of simple villains and victims, but of choices made in comfort and desperation, of beliefs shaped by greed and fear, and of futures built on the backs of those who were never asked if they wished to contribute. And as your eyes begin to close, lulled by the gentle hum of cicadas and the far-off sound of water lapping against a dock, you realize that the story of colonial America cannot be told without this chapter, that the wealth which built cities, funded universities, and financed revolutions was grown in fields where freedom was forbidden, and that to understand the true cost of empire, one must look not just at what was gained, but at what and who was taken. Colonial women, the invisible architecture of survival in the dusty corners of early colonial settlements, past the maps that trace conquests and the portraits of men in ruffled collars and polished boots. There is another story unfolding, one quieter, one rarely celebrated in textbooks or triumphal plaques, but without which the entire colonial experiment might have collapsed before it could even stumble forward. And that is the story of women, the invisible architecture of survival in a world built for men but maintained daily. stubbornly, and often silently by those whose names were rarely recorded unless they died in childbirth, broke a law, or married well. And as you step into this chapter, you are not greeted by fanfare or muskets, but by the scent of wood, the clatter of a wooden spoon against an iron pot, the rhythmic swish of a broom across a dirt floor, and the murmurs of lullabies whispered in dozens of languages brought from across oceans. And it is dawn in a colonial village, and while men debate over laws, property, and expansion, the women are already at work, not just managing households but orchestrating the entire rhythm of daily life, milking cows, grinding grain, weaving cloth, tending gardens, boiling herbs into medicines, raising children, washing linens, preparing meals, and burying the dead. And in between all this they pray, teach, negotiate, and endure, for colonial women existed in layers defined by class, race, region, and religion, and though popular imagination might reduce them all to obedient housewives in white bonnets, the truth was infinitely more varied. And you see now a Puritan woman in Massachusetts, her hands red from cold water, her posture rigid not from piety alone, but from the daily pressure of keeping a family alive through brutal winters and social scrutiny. And she is literate, intelligent, and quietly powerful in a way that only someone who runs a household of 10 can be, and her husband's voice may dominate town meetings, but it is she who ensures that the home does not unravel into chaos. And not far away, in a more tolerant Dutch settlement, another woman runs a small shop out of her home, legally allowed to own property and conduct business in her own name, something nearly unthinkable in English colonies at the same time. And she writes letters in Dutch to relatives in Amsterdam, orders fabric from overseas, and handles negotiations with customers, including bartering with native women for handmade baskets and smoked fish. And her world is transactional, not romantic, and her competence keeps her family in comfort. And further south, in the sweltering fields of Virginia, the reality shifts once more. Here, white women live with a different set of expectations, expected to be obedient, to bear many children, to uphold a facade of gentility, yet many of them face the same physical and emotional tolls of hardship as any settler. And miscarriage, illness, and death are constant companions, and many will outlive multiple husbands or die young themselves. And enslaved women, by contrast, endure a different, brutal world altogether, where their labor is coerced, their children can be taken or sold, and their bodies are not only unfree but often exploited. And these women still find ways to resist, to mother, to teach, to pray, in whispered tones and songs that survive centuries. And they garden secret herbs behind slave cabins, pass on African traditions, and build networks of care even under the watchful eye of overseers. And their names are largely lost to history, but their legacy pulses through every story that follows. And you walk now through a small kitchen garden, where herbs are not just culinary but medicinal: yarrow for wounds, comfrey for sprains, chamomile for calming restless infants. And these women were healers, whether formally trained or simply skilled through generational knowledge. And when sickness came, fever, flux, or pox, it was often the women who treated the ill long before a doctor could be summoned, and often more effectively. And in towns, and on remote farms alike, midwives held a strange authority, both respected and feared. They ushered life into the world with bloodied hands and whispered prayers, and they often carried the stories of whole communities, knowing who was born, when, who miscarried, who survived, and who didn't, and their reputations could make or break them. And accusations of witchcraft often hovered over those women who were too independent, too skilled, or too different. And yet, despite this constant presence, women had almost no formal political power. They could not vote, rarely held office, and had limited legal rights. And a married woman, under English common law, had no separate legal identity from her husband's. She could not sign contracts, sue or be sued, or own property in her own right. But even within these restrictions, women maneuvered, and widows often inherited land and managed estates with remarkable effectiveness. And daughters of merchants learned to keep books and correspond with suppliers. And some women, especially in Quaker and Moravian communities, were encouraged to speak publicly, to lead spiritually, and to teach. And religious diversity often dictated how much autonomy a woman could expect. And education was a luxury, but not an impossibility. And in wealthier families, girls learned to read, write, and cipher, not necessarily for careers but to run a household, write letters, manage accounts. And in lower-income families, education might be informal oral storytelling, Bible readings, and practical instruction passed down mother to daughter, aunt to niece. And books written by women were rare but not unheard of. Anne Bradstreet, for instance, became the first published poet in the American colonies, writing verses from a deeply personal and reflective space, grappling with her faith, her losses, and her sense of self. And her work was considered so unusual that it had to be published in London with a preface apologizing for her boldness. And still it endured, and as towns grew, some women found ways to defy the expectations laid upon them, and they ran inns, taverns, and boarding houses, and they taught children from neighboring families, and they sold cheese, thread, candles, and home remedies, and many widows remarried, not out of romance, but survival. Strategic unions meant to consolidate resources or avoid destitution, and in port cities like Boston, New York, and Charleston, a small but significant number of free black women also carved out niches, often working as seamstresses, healers, and domestic workers, and their lives were fraught with legal challenges and social prejudice. But their presence remains a testament to the complexity of early American society. And you pause now beneath the rafters of a small wooden home, the smell of cooking cabbage in the air, and you think about the thousands of women who passed through this continent during those early centuries, not as passengers on the journey of empire, but as its laborers, sustainers, and survivors, and their names are often missing from the official records. Their lives reduced to line items in wills, census forms, or baptismal registries, but their impact, it is everywhere, in the fields sown with seeds they planted, in the stories they whispered beside hearth fires, in the survival of colonies that would not have lasted a single winter without their work. And as your eyes grow heavy, as the flicker of candlelight dances across worn wooden beams, you feel a deep and quiet reverence not just for the heroines remembered, but for the countless women whose hands shaped history in flour, in stitches, in swaddled arms, and in the patient courage of simply carrying on, day after day, without applause, but with unwavering resolve. For these women were not just background figures, they were the silent architecture that held up the entire colonial world. The colonial mail. How letters traveled before roads and rules, before the clatter of typewriters, before email, postage stamps, or post offices with set hours and printed forms. There was the colonial mail system, a slow, improvisational, and deeply unreliable tangle of couriers, tavern owners, sea captains, neighbors, and the occasional wandering stranger, all bound together by one shared belief that communication mattered, even if it sometimes arrived months late or not at all. And as you step into this network of parchment and patience, you realize that mail in the American colonies was never just about letters. It was about staying alive in a world where distance could mean death, where isolation was more dangerous than the wild, and where news, whether joyful or grim, had to travel by river, by foot, by sail, and often by sheer human will. You begin your walk at a small port in Boston around the year 1700, where a merchant is nervously handing a sealed letter to a ship captain headed for London. The letter is folded tightly, not placed in an envelope, since envelopes cost extra, and wasted paper. Wax seals guard it not only from tampering but from the elements. There is no guarantee this letter will arrive. Storms could sink the ship, pirates could seize the cargo, the captain might forget, or worse, open it himself. But still, the merchant sends it, because that paper contains orders for goods, updates on debts, possibly a personal message to a brother or cousin. It is not just mail, it is trust, folded into layers. Back inland, along the dusty post roads of Virginia or Pennsylvania, another kind of mail is moving, the handwritten news of a colonial world that is slowly stitching itself together. A woman writes to her sister 3 towns away, updating her on the recent birth of a child, the loss of a neighbor, or the infestation of caterpillars in her garden. She hands the letter to a passing tradesman heading in that direction. He agrees to deliver it, though no one can be quite sure when. Maybe he forgets, maybe he hands it to someone else halfway, maybe it ends up on a tavern counter until someone curious enough picks it up and completes the journey. And somehow, despite this chaos, letters do arrive, wrinkled, worn, stained with candle wax or sweat, but still legible, still beating with the pulse of human connection. You pass through a tavern now, one of the many informal mail stations scattered across the colonies. There is no sign outside saying post office, but people know this is where letters are dropped off and picked up. The innkeeper has a box behind the counter with a pile of names scribbled in no particular order. There are letters meant for New Haven, Philadelphia, Charleston, and even Jamaica. He does not sort them, he does not open them. He waits for travelers, headed in the right direction. Sometimes they take payment for the delivery. Sometimes they just carry it for kindness or curiosity. No one is quite sure what the rules are, but they do it anyway. Because mail is not a luxury, it is a lifeline. The British Crown, realizing the strategic importance of communication in a growing colonial world, begins to formalize things. By the mid-1700s, the first official postal routes are created. Benjamin Franklin, already a printer, publisher, and general innovator, is appointed Joint Postmaster General in 1753. He introduces mile markers along postal roads, standardizes delivery times as much as possible, and even inspects routes personally to make them more efficient. Under Franklin, mail becomes faster, though still far from fast. A letter from New York to Philadelphia might take 2 days, remarkably swift for the time. From Boston to Charleston, a week or more, and overseas, weeks or even months, depending on the weather. But what matters is that there is now some expectation, some shared understanding, that letters will move through a system, however fragile. You watch Franklin work, hunched over maps, marking out routes with a quill, arguing with officials about rates and timetables. He sees mail not just as communication but as infrastructure. He believes that a colony connected by letters is a colony with a shared identity. And in many ways he is right. Still, most colonists never see this more formal side of the mail. For them, the system remains deeply personal and informal. Women often write letters in the early morning hours before the day's work begins, dipping quills into inkwells made from carved bones, writing on paper that is often scarce and expensive. They dry the ink by shaking sand onto the page, then blow it gently away. Children learn to write by copying these letters. Families write to relatives across oceans they will never see again. In one small cabin, a woman writes to her son in London, begging him to send more wool, to describe the city, to remember his little sister's face. That letter might take 4 months to arrive. His reply might take another 4. A year may pass between message and response. And yet they write, because to write is to remember, and to receive a letter is to be remembered. In towns and cities, printers publish broadsides and gazettes filled with letters from readers, often signed with pseudonyms. These early newspapers become another form of mail, a way for people to read what others are thinking, feeling, fearing. Letters between governors and military officers carry vital news of uprisings, invasions, or weather disasters. During wartime, the mail becomes both more important and more dangerous. Censors may intercept it. Messengers may be captured. Codes and invisible inks are used to send secret messages. A single intercepted letter might change the outcome of a battle. Still, people keep writing. For enslaved people and indentured servants, mail is often forbidden or inaccessible. But even here, communication persists through word of mouth, through songs that carry messages, through trusted allies who risk punishment to carry a note or whisper a memory. In slaveholding colonies, authorities fear the written word at the hands of the enslaved, knowing it can spark rebellion, hope, or flight. And so many enslaved people learn to write in secret at night, hiding scraps of paper under floorboards, composing letters they may never send but which hold power nonetheless. Mail is not just letters. It is also packages, though rare and costly. A mother might send a pair of hand-knit socks to her daughter in another colony. A merchant might ship samples of silk, tobacco, or spices, along with a price list. Books pass from hand to hand, sometimes official religious texts, sometimes banned, revolutionary tracts. Each package is carefully wrapped, sealed, and prayed over. The journey might be rough. Rain, mud, bandits, or clumsy handlers might damage the contents, but still they are sent. And somewhere along the line, the person who receives it has days, weeks, or even a season and wraps it with trembling fingers, knowing that the object in their hand passed through many others to reach them. Mail also becomes a form of social glue. It maintains friendships across distance. It allows lovers to woo from afar. It lets people confess, console, advise, and confess sins too risky to say aloud. One colonial preacher, far from his home congregation, receives letters full of questions about doctrine, morality, and gossip. He answers them in turn, sometimes with fire and brimstone, sometimes with surprising tenderness. Letters allow private thoughts to travel where bodies cannot. They are emotional currency, not just information. As the colonies edged toward rebellion in the 1770s, the postal system becomes even more political. Patriots and loyalists both understand the value of controlling the mail. Franklin is removed from his post in 1774 for sympathizing with revolutionaries. In response, the Continental Congress establishes its own mail system, completely separate from British control. Riders on fast horse, so many of them young boys, carry letters from one rebel stronghold to another. Mail is hidden under saddles, inside shoes, or stitched into clothes. Women play a key role in this underground mail network, passing messages during tea visits or slipping notes into the baskets of peddlers. For the first time, mail becomes a weapon, a way to organize resistance, to spread radical ideas, to imagine a future without kings. And yet, for ordinary people, the dream remains simple: to send a thought across the miles and know that someone will one day hold it, read it, and know that they are not alone. You sit now by a candlelit table, quill in hand, writing a letter to a sister you have not seen in 5 years. You tell her of the birth of your third child, of the early frost that killed your squash, of the passing of old Mr. Fletcher. You seal the paper with wax, press your ring into it, and give it to a neighbor who knows a farmer who knows a trader. Heading north, you don't know when or if it will arrive, but you hope, and that hope is what kept the colonial mail alive. Not efficiency, not organization, but human longing. And as your eyes begin to close, soothed by the soft creak of a rocking chair and the faint smell of wax and ink, you realize something simple and beautiful in a world without phones or fast trains. The slow magic of the colonial mail turned distance into something bearable, one letter at a time. Colonial music and midnight songs, the hidden soundtrack of early America. There is something haunting about the sounds that never make it into history books: the creak of a fiddle late at night, the uneven tapping of a child's feet on a wooden floor as she tries to follow her mother's clapping rhythm, the low hum of a field song carried on the wind long after the overseer has passed, the whispered harmonies of hymns sung in candlelit parlors, the distant beat of a borrowed drum, muffled under layers of fear and survival. These are the melodies of early America, not the official anthems, not the powdered wig symphonies heard in the halls of governors and elites, but the music of the colonists themselves, in their bedrooms, barns, churches, and secret gatherings. And as you step into the soundscape of the 17th and 18th centuries, you begin to realize that this colonial world was not silent, not by any means. It pulsed with rhythms improvised from longing, from memory, from resistance, and from joy. The colonists brought with them many things: tools, beliefs, illnesses, hopes, but perhaps nothing traveled farther than their music. From the docks of London and the hills of Ireland, from the plains of West Africa and the forests of Germany, music crossed oceans, languages, and bodies. It was packed invisibly into satchels and stowed in the minds of those who couldn't bring anything else. The Puritans, famously austere, brought the Psalter with them, the Book of Psalms, sung a cappella in grave, measured tones. To their ears, music had a sacred purpose, a spiritual weight. Instruments were frowned upon, and yet, in private, even the most devout might hum a folk tune from their childhood while tending a fire, or lull a child to sleep with a melody not found in scripture. In contrast, the southern colonies echoed with a more raucous blend of sounds. Here taverns hosted fiddlers, who played for hours as dancers stomped in packed dirt floors, mixing Irish reels with African rhythms, German polkas with Caribbean syncopation. The result was something messy and beautiful, a distinctly colonial music that couldn't be found anywhere else in the world. Among the enslaved communities, music took on even greater importance. It was memory. It was resistance. It was language. Songs sung in the fields often held double-meaning spirituals that spoke of biblical liberation while hinting at earthly escape. A line about crossing the Jordan could just as easily refer to crossing into free territory. Melodies passed from mother to child contained coded warnings, stories of origin, or simply the comfort of something that was theirs, untouched by the brutal hand of slavery. These songs didn't exist on paper. They were shared orally, adapted constantly, surviving despite laws that banned drums and dancing, despite punishments for gathering or celebrating. A rhythm tapped on a washboard, a beat kept on a hoe handle, a tune hummed under breath. These were acts of rebellion, of dignity, of spiritual endurance. And not all colonial music was for humans. Bells rang from churches and meetings, their tones marking time, summoning congregations, or warning of fire and invasion. Wind chimes made from spoons or glass hung from doorways. Even the animals became part of the soundscape: roosters crowing before dawn, cows lowing at dusk, the scrape of horseshoes on stone roads. At night, music took on a different tone. It became softer, more personal. In the northern colonies, especially among families of German or Dutch descent, singing was a cherished part of evening rituals. Children sang rounds with their parents, or simple call and response songs designed to reinforce memory and morality. "Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep" was more than a prayer, it was a lullaby, a comfort in a world where sleep wasn't always guaranteed, and morning wasn't promised. In more affluent homes, Girls learned to play the harpsichord or spinet, performing polite minuets and dances for guests. Sheet music was rare and expensive, but prized. Music lessons were a mark of refinement, and young women might spend hours mastering simple pieces by European composers. But often they also knew folk songs, tunes passed from servant to child, from enslaved nurse to colonial heir. These melodies blurred the lines of class, race, and culture in ways no law could fully prevent. You now sit by a hearth where a mother sings a tune she learned from her Scottish grandmother, while the girl beside her hums a variation picked up from an African nanny. This blending was not always harmonious in society, but in music it was natural, inevitable, and ongoing. Public celebrations brought music into the streets. On days like the king's birthday, weddings, or military victories, drums and fifes led parades through town centers. Militias marched to the beat of simple tunes meant to coordinate steps and boost morale. Yankee Doodle, before it became an anthem, was a mocking tune sung by British officers to belittle American colonists, who in turn adopted it as a symbol of defiance. This back-and-forth transformation of song was common, as colonists reshaped and reclaimed music to fit their own identities. Dancing was common, though attitudes varied widely. In Puritan New England, dancing was frowned upon or even banned in public settings, but elsewhere it was a central part of community life. Barn dances, harvest festivals, and weddings were incomplete without a fiddler and a floor. The dances themselves were often group affairs, no romantic waltzes here, but jigs, reels, and circle dances that allowed everyone to participate. Men and women followed well-known steps, called out in real time. The music was fast, the feet faster, and though it exhausted them, they kept dancing because music made the harshness of colonial life bearable. Music also played a role in mourning. Funeral processions sometimes included slow, somber marches led by a single drum or bell. Hymns were sung graveside, with voices cracking from grief. In some communities, keening the act of wailing and musical lament was practiced, particularly by Irish settlers. Music helped people process the cycle of life and death, joy and sorrow. It made the invisible bearable. Even those who could not play an instrument or sing a tune still had music in their lives. The rhythms of chores, the repetition of prayers, the lullabies of wind through pine trees, these formed the ambient music of the colonial world. You now lie in a loft above a kitchen, listening as someone below rocks a cradle and sings softly. You can't make out the words, but the melody is familiar. Perhaps it's one you've heard before. Perhaps it was sung to you, or perhaps it is new, but somehow it feels eternal, because this was the secret power of colonial music. It connected the living to each other, and to the past, and even to futures they would never see. Many of these songs were never written down. They survive today in fragments, in recordings made centuries later, in oral histories passed from generation to generation. Some evolved into American folk standards, others were lost to time, known only in the echoes of descendants or in the rhythms of newer songs built atop their forgotten foundations. But for those who lived in early America, music was never just entertainment. It was breath, it was memory, it was prayer, it was protest. And as your eyes drift closed tonight, and the imagined strains of an old fiddle tune weave their way through your thoughts, you begin to hear history not as a list of battles or treaties, but as a song, a long, winding melody full of sorrow, strength, and survival, sung by countless voices across candlelit rooms and firelit fields, holding on to each other in a world too large to face in silence. Colonial smells, the forgotten sense of early America. If you truly want to understand colonial American, just what it looked like, but what it felt like to walk its muddy streets, to sleep in its timber-framed homes, or to wake before dawn. With 100 chores already waiting, you must begin by inhaling, not the imaginary crispness of a romanticized past, but the real, raw, often overwhelming scent of a world without plumbing, refrigeration, garbage trucks, or commercial soap. The colonial era was not a silent painting frozen in time. It was alive with the odors of life and death, of labor and celebration, of human bodies and their animals, of boiling pots and burning tallow. You are standing now in the doorway of a small colonial cottage. It's just past sunrise. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke as dozens of chimneys up and down the village trail begin their morning routines. The scent is comforting, yes, but also sharp with resin and a faint sourness from yesterday's ashes. Inside, a woman stirs a pot of porridge over the hearth oats water, a bit of salt if she's lucky, and the humid steam mingles with the lingering Thames of last night's stew. If meat was cooked recently, the scent of fat lingers, absorbed into the wooden beams of the ceiling. into clothing, into hair. There is no Febreze, no exhaust fan, no escape. Every action leaves an olfactory fingerprint, and in this world, you carry your chores with you and your scent. Step outside, and the landscape assaults you with its own mix of aromas. Chickens cluck beside piles of fresh droppings. Horses and oxen pass by, their manure steamy in the early light. Pigs root through slop in pens behind houses. The sludge a blend of vegetable peels, meat scraps, and sour milk. There is no designated garbage collection. Waste is tossed behind homes, into streams, or buried in shallow pits. As you walk past a tavern, its backyard reeks of old ale, grease, spilled food, and the sweat of men who've been drinking since dawn. But oddly, none of this is particularly shocking to the nose of the time. Colonists are used to these smells. They are part of the rhythm of life. A fresh road of pine logs, a joy, a cartload of sea fish brought in from the coast, a blessing, even if it smells like rot. Olfactory tolerance is different in this era. People know how to recognize the scent of illness, of spoilage, of infection, not because they are told by a label, but because their noses are trained by necessity. Inside wealthier homes, the odors are different but not necessarily cleaner. Candles made of beeswax might sweeten the air slightly, but most people burn tallow-rendered animal fat which emits a pungent, greasy smell as it melts. Chamber pots under beds are rarely emptied more than once a day. In the summer, the stench can be unbearable, especially in tightly packed cities like Boston or Philadelphia. Streets become open sewers after rain, but even amid this harsh olfactory reality, people try to mask what they can. Housewives boil rosemary, lavender, or juniper and place the steaming pots in corners. Herbs are hung in bundles from rafters. Handkerchiefs are dabbed with vinegar or oils. Some women even tuck cloves into their stays or wear balls of spice and citrusine ribbons around their waists. In churches, where dozens or even hundreds gather in woolen garments during long sermons, the collective body odor is dense and musty. Ministers sometimes keep posies in the pulpit not for decoration, but for smelling when the air becomes unbearable. One of the most powerful colonial smells is that of industry. In the outskirts of towns, tanneries reek with the acrid stench of lime, urine, and decomposing hides. Leather is essentially used for shoes, belts, saddles, bookbindings, but the process is gruesome. Hides are soaked in urine to loosen hair, then scraped clean, then steeped in tannins from bark. The result is a miasma so intense that neighbors complain constantly, but few are willing to do without leather. Soap making is another offensive art, rendering fat with lye, a process so caustic that it can burn skin and turn stomachs. Blacksmith shops radiate heat and the smell of scorched metal, sweat, and smoke. In these places, the scent of progress is not sweet, it's bitter, sooty, and undeniable. Walk down to the harbor and you'll find a different olfactory landscape. Barrels of salted fish, molasses from the West Indies oozing over wooden staves, tobacco in dense bricks, rum sloshing from half-sealed casks, tar and pitch coat the ropes and timbers of every docked vessel. The ocean air tries to mask it all with salt and breeze, but the cargo speaks louder. Even the scent of humans changes here. Sailors, unbathed for weeks, emanate layers of brine, mildew, and unwashed cloth. Yet for the merchants and dock workers, this is the smell of commerce, of livelihood. It is, to them, the scent of survival. Now return to a simple farmhouse miles from any town. In spring, the air is thick with mud and the sweet rot of last year's leaves. Cattle births mean blood and afterbirth on the straw. In summer, the scent of hay competes with sweat and damp wool. By autumn, everything smells of smoke and apples and drying herbs. But winter is perhaps the most distinct. Cold suppresses odor. Food is dried or salted. People wash less. Fires are constant. The entire house smells of smoke, wet boots, and boiled cabbage. It's not pleasant, but it is familiar. And within that familiarity is a sense of safety, of continuity. The scent of wet wool drying by the fire might not be romantic, but it means the family made it home. It means the day's work is done. Perfume exists in colonial America, but only for the wealthy. Imported from Europe, these glass bottles contain rosewater, lavender, musk, and civet. Some colonists try to make their own distilling herbs or petals and copper stills, but for most, daily scent is dictated not by choice but by labor and location. A baker smells like flour and yeast, a cooper like pitch and wood shavings, a farm girl like hay milk and sweat. There is no artificial divide between scent and identity. People expect to smell like what they do, and the notion of freshness as we know it doesn't exist. Sickness, too, has a smell. Before germ theory, people associate illness with miasma, bad air. A house where someone is dying is filled with the scent of vinegar used to purify, of burning herbs used to ward off evil, and of body waste, decay, and linen soaked with fevered sweat. Midwives and healers recognize infections by scent. The difference between healing and dying can sometimes be smelled before it is seen. Corpses, when they come, are buried quickly, but not before their presence is deeply inhaled by the household. In summer, graves must be dug in haste, lime sprinkled over bodies, and windows kept open. Food, finally, is the one area where smell brings near universal pleasure. A pie cooling on a sill, cornbread baking in a skillet, coffee rare and treasured, bubbling on a hearth. Dried herbs releasing their oils in hot broth, the surprise joy of a ripe peach, or the wafting aroma of gingerbread at Christmas. These smells bring comfort in memory. Even in hunger, colonists learn to cook in ways that tease the senses, roasting onions over flame, adding cloves or nutmeg to simple porridge, brewing cider that fills a room with spicy warmth. Guests remember homes by what they smelled like, as much as by what was said. Courtship, too, had its own scent, boys gifting sprigs of mint or basil, girls wearing flower petals in their bonnets, dances held in barns heavy with the scent of straw, dust, and expectation. And so as you sit now in a quiet room, candle flickering beside you, close your eyes and imagine not the picture-perfect colonial postcard, but the real world of scent that surrounded every gesture, every labor, every rest. The sting of vinegar on scraped knees, the sourness of wet leather, the sharp, sweet smell of sap in spring, the smoky embrace of a winter hearth. These were the smells that defined a people far more than flags or creeds or declarations. Smells that told you who someone was, where they had been, and whether they could be trusted. Smells that marked birth, death, celebration, work, and love. Smells that lingered in cloth, in walls, in memory. Smells that, even now, lie buried under centuries of scrubbed history, waiting to rise again if only you dare to breathe deep enough. And as your breath slows, and your thoughts settle, you find yourself not in a museum, but in a living, breathing world where the past does not speak, but sense, and every inhalation is a lesson. Every exhale a surrender to the truth that history was never clean, never sanitized, and never silent. It was alive, and it smelled like it. Colonial clothing, what you wore, why it itched, and how it told everyone who you were as you reached for your shirt in the soft haze of dawn. But instead of smooth cotton or synthetic blends, your fingers find coarse, scratchy linen, uneven and stiff from a recent wash in lye soap and river water. There is no elastic waistband waiting, no ironed collar or brand tag. Your clothes have no label but your life. In colonial America, clothing was not just protection from the elements, was identity, status, punishment, and sometimes even law. Before you stepped outside each day, what you wore had already told the world everything it needed to know about your gender, your class, your race, your religion, your labor, and your region. There were no zippers, no snaps, no machine seams. Instead, clothes were tied, pinned, laced, or fastened with hand-forged metal buttons. Each stitch had a story, each fabric had a limit, and each layer meant something. Your first stop is a village green in Massachusetts Bay Colony around 1680. You're surrounded by sober, dark-dyed woolens and high-necked collars. Puritan fashion is austere, not because they didn't care about looks, but because color and frill were viewed as expressions of vanity and sin. Men wore broad-brimmed hats, linen shirts, breeches, and plain waistcoats. Women wore long gowns with fitted bodices and full skirts over petticoats, usually covered with aprons. Everyone wore stays, a sort of early corset, even children. Linen shifts were worn under everything, both as a modesty layer and because they could be washed more often than outer garments. If your collar was dirty, it meant your shift was dirty, and that told everyone how clean you really were. Shoes were hard, leather and buckled or tied if you were poorer. Stockings were wool or linen, held up by garters. Laces were handmade. Caps were essential. Women wore white linen coifs or mob caps, even indoors, and men often wore nightcaps to bed. Not wearing a cap was sometimes seen as a sign of madness, mourning, or rebellion. But further south, in the plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas, fashion was more influenced by the English gentry. Bright silks, patterned brocades, powdered wigs, cravats, and gold-trimmed waistcoats were worn by wealthy landowners eager to assert their place in the imperial hierarchy. Balls and formal dinners demanded full dress. Men dressed to display wealth. Women dressed to be seen. Gowns with panniers that extended several feet wide, shoes with delicate heels, and fans. Imported from France or China, such opulence clashed with the dirt roads and mosquito-ridden air. But it persisted because clothing, in this world, was also performance. Now enter the life of someone working your farmhand, a washerwoman, a blacksmith's apprentice. Their clothing is practical, cheap, and often repurposed. Most colonists owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothing, one for daily labor, and one best outfit for church or funerals. When something tore, it was patched. When it stained, it was turned inside out. Clothes were passed down, altered, and refashioned until the fabric literally disintegrated. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, and sewing were done at home or by local tradespeople. Indigo, walnut, and cochineal provided color, but dyeing was expensive, and most clothing was dull brown, gray, or cream. Washing was a chore done weekly at most. Lye soap burned skin and damaged cloth. There were no detergents, no bleach, no fabric softeners, only brute force and boiling water. The smell of soap lingered long after washing day, sharp and medicinal. Enslaved people had the fewest clothing options. Most were given coarse linen or Negro cloth, a scratchy, loosely woven fabric made cheaply in Europe. Garments were issued once or twice a year, often with little regard for size or climate. Shoes were a luxury. Many enslaved individuals went barefoot year-round. But within these limits, enslaved communities found ways to personalize and resist. Head wraps, beads, sashes, and patchwork patterns spoke to African traditions and individual creativity. Even under oppression, style persisted. The head, in particular, became a symbol of both heritage and endurance, used to protect hair during labor, to carry messages, or to show affiliation. Indigenous clothing in the colonies was entirely different and far more adapted to the environment. In warmer climates, native groups wore minimal garments made from deerskin, bark fiber, or woven grass. In colder areas, animal furs, robes, and moccasins were common. Decoration included quillwork, beads, and painted designs. After contact with Europeans, Native Americans began incorporating metal buttons, glass beads, and wool trade cloth into their attire, creating hybrid fashions that often bewildered colonists. What some called savage dress was, in reality, highly symbolic, ceremonial, and suited to geography. Clothing marked age, status, and tribal identity. It was also political. Choosing to wear or reject European garments became a statement. Back in the colonies, religious affiliation shaped what you wore. Quakers, for example, dressed plainly. Their plain dress movement avoided ornament, bright colors, or anything deemed prideful. Buttons were frowned upon. Hooks and eyes were preferred. Even children were dressed in miniature adult garments, boys in gowns until they could walk, then girls in full skirts from toddlerhood. Clothing aged with its wearer. Young girls learned to sew by making samplers. By marriage, most women were skilled in mending, hemming, and altering. Husbands might not know how to turn a collar or fix a hem, but wives were expected to clothe entire households. Colonial clothing also had laws attached. Sumptuary laws restricted who could wear what, silk, velvet, laced, based on income or class. These were rarely enforced, but they reflected deep anxieties about social mobility. Dressing above your station could draw ridicule or worse. In cities, fashion was a theater of wealth. In rural areas, it was survival. What you wore could get you hired or shunned, arrested or married. There were no uniforms as such, but every trade had its look. Aprons for bakers, smocks for painters, stained breeches for butchers. Even political leanings could be shown in dress. Homespun cloth, for example, became a symbol of resistance during the lead-up to the American Revolution. To wear British goods was to support the crown. To spin your own wool and weave your own cloth was to take a stand. And what of nightwear? Most people slept in their shifts or long shirts. There were no pajamas. A bedcap kept the head warm. Nightgowns in the modern sense didn't exist. Privacy was minimal. Families often slept several to a room, even to a bed. Undressing was functional, not romantic. In winter, people sometimes slept in most of their clothes. In summer, they sweated under linen sheets and mosquito netting. There was no was hung from pegs or stored in chests. Mothballs were not yet a thing. Clothes were aired out in sunlight, pounded with sticks, or smoked to deter insects. Makeup was rare and frowned upon, especially among Puritans. Lip color or rouge might be used by the elite or by prostitutes, but rarely by respectable women. Hair was worn up, covered or powdered with flour. Men of status wore wigs curled, powdered, and often laced with lavender. Maintaining a wig was a full-time task. Poorer men wore their own hair, tied back if long. Beards were common early. on but clean-shaven faces became fashionable by the mid-1700s. Shaving was done with straight razors, soap, and a steady hand. Cuts were frequent. There was no aftershave, only cold water and luck. Scented sachets were sometimes sewn into clothing. Violets, lavender, and cloves masked mildew or sweat. Sewing pockets into dresses was rare. Women carried small tied pouches. Instead, men had pockets stitched into their waistcoats or breeches. Buttons were handmade wood, bone, or metal. Lace was painstakingly knotted by hand. There were no sewing machines, no mass production. A single garment might take days or weeks to complete. As you lie back now, eyes growing heavy, imagine peeling off layers of wool, unpinning a linen cap, unlacing stays, folding garments that carry the dust and smoke and labor of your entire day. Each piece is heavy, each holds warmth, sweat, perhaps a drop of soup, or a child's tear wiped on a sleeve. This is what clothing was: not fashion, not branding, not seasonal trends, but wearable biography. You didn't just choose what to wear. Your clothing told your story, often before you spoke a word. And so, as you drift towards sleep, remember the way a life was measured in fabric and form. Stains were memories, seams were milestones, buttons were choices, and the body beneath it all. That was the one thing colonial clothing never lied about. You wore who you were, and the world, smelling of wood smoke and wool, nodded silently back. Colonial dreams, what people feared, hoped, and imagined while they slept in the quiet dark of a colonial night. Long after the embers in the hearth had dimmed and the last chores had been completed by lantern light, people settled into beds or pallets, not just to rest their bodies, but to drift into a world that, to them, was as real and important as the waking one. Sleep in colonial America was not seen merely as recovery or respite. It was sacred, mysterious, and sometimes terrifying. Dreams, those nightly visitors of image and feeling, were thought to come from many sources: divine messages, omens of fate, or remnants of unconfessed sins. You lie now on a straw-stuffed mattress, the rough ticking fabric beneath you scratching your arms, the smell of sheep's wool and dust filling your nose, and you try to sleep, but your mind is still alive, still turning. Maybe you're a farmer who dreamt last week of locusts and now fears the next harvest. Maybe you're a mother who saw a lost child in a dream and now prays harder before bed. Or perhaps you're just someone hoping for the comfort of seeing a departed loved one again, if only in sleep. To the colonists, dreams were not abstract, they mattered. They were recorded, shared, debated, even preached about from pulpits. A dream might mean a message from God, a sign of coming judgment, or proof of a guilty conscience. Ministers wrote sermons warning that impure dreams came from Satan. A dream about flying might indicate pride. A dream about fire, lust, or spiritual destruction. Entire pamphlets were published offering dream interpretations, blending folk beliefs with biblical citations. Even illiterate colonists might know what a dream of teeth falling out meant. It meant death was nearby. Sleep was not a single stretch of unconsciousness. Most people followed a segmented sleep pattern, going to bed shortly after nightfall, sleeping for 4 or 5 hours, waking in the middle of the night for an hour or more, and then sleeping again until dawn. During that nighttime waking period, sometimes called the watch, people might pray, stoke the fire, check on animals, talk with one another, or even reflect on or write down their dreams. Night was not empty. It was rich with layers. In cities, sleep was frequently disturbed. Horses clopped down cobblestone streets. Dogs barked. Taverns stayed loud. In the countryside, owls called, trees creaked, and wolves sometimes howled. Without electric lights, darkness was complete. Candles were costly and rarely burned all night. Some slept with flint and steel nearby in case a fire was needed quickly. Others left a single coal burning under a clay dome to preserve heat until morning. For many, nighttime was a vulnerable time. Bandits, fires, and illness struck most often in the dark. It was said that ghosts walked after midnight. Colonists feared witches entering their homes in the form of cats or vapors. Some people slept with iron tools or scissors near the bed to ward off evil. Dreamcatchers, adopted from Native American cultures in later generations, originated from a similar fear that dreams could be dangerous unless filtered. In the South, Gullah and African-descended communities had their own rich beliefs about dreams and spirits. Dreams could reveal the identity of someone who had cursed you, or guide you in healing. An ancestor might appear to offer advice or warnings. Children were taught to remember their dreams and report them to elders. Dreams, in this world, were not random. They were echoes of the unseen. Sleep itself was elusive for many. There were no sleeping pills, no white noise machines, no blackout curtains. Insomnia was a common affliction, though it wasn't called that. Instead, people spoke of broken rest or fitful nights. Remedies included warm milk, herbal teas made of chamomile, valerian or hops, and recitations of psalms. Some believed that sleeping with a Bible under your pillow would prevent nightmares. Others placed bread under the bed to absorb bad spirits. A sleepless person might rise and walk barefoot through their house, checking on the coals, the latches, and their own thoughts. Night was a time of both solitude and reflection. In dreams, people sometimes found escape. A man confined to his town might dream of flying over the ocean. A woman weary from childbirth might dream of dancing. A slave might dream of walking freely. Even when life was hard and limited, dreams could open doors that reality kept closed. In dreams, you could speak to the dead, argue with kings, or visit cities you'd only heard described. The brain stitched together fragments, voices, fears, memories, scriptures into strange mosaics, and while many dreams were forgotten upon waking, some lingered. Colonial diaries contain numerous entries like, "Dreamt I saw my father holding a candle, awoke in tears," or, "Last night dreamt of a snake in my boot, shall not walk far today." These notes were not just personal, they were sometimes seen as divine counsel. In Puritan culture especially, dreams could be a source of anxiety. Ministers warned that lustful or violent dreams were signs of a corrupted soul. To wake from such a dream meant to immediately pray and repent. Parents asked their children about their dreams as a way of gauging their inner state. The devil, it was believed, worked through temptation in sleep just as he did in waking hours. To fall asleep angry or prideful was considered dangerous. Hence the proverb, "Do not let the sun go down on your wrath." Bedtime prayers were not optional. They were shields. In Catholic communities, dreams had a different texture. Saints might appear in visions. Dreams of Mary or of angels were recorded with awe. A dream about a lost rosary might lead to real-life confession. Mystical experiences were taken seriously, and some nuns and monks kept detailed dream journals. In both Protestant and Catholic households, sleep was also associated with death. Laid to rest meant more than metaphor. A sudden death in sleep was feared, not because of its painlessness, but because it left no time for last rites or repentance. Hence the bedtime ritual. "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord, my soul to keep." This was not a childish rhyme. It was spiritual armor. Dreams were also political. During the Revolutionary War, some patriots claimed they were inspired by dreams, visions of liberty, of battles won, of ancestors calling them to resist tyranny. These dreams were shared in letters, sometimes even in newspapers. George Washington, famously reserved, reportedly had a recurring dream of a rising sun. Was it prophetic, symbolic? No one knew. But such stories were part of the dreamscape of the nation. Sleep became not just rest, but rehearsal for the future. For a better world, children's dreams were a concern of both parents and preachers. Stories were told of wicked boys who dreamt of fire and brimstone after stealing apples, or girls who dreamt of angels after learning their catechism. These stories reinforced moral behavior. Children were encouraged to confess their dreams, and some were even punished for evil thoughts they could not control. But in more private homes, mothers rocked children to sleep with lullabies that promised sweet dreams, not damnation. These songs, handed down through generations, often had haunting melodies and whispered reassurances. "Go to sleep, my little baby. When you wake, you'll have sweet cake." The cake was imaginary, but the comfort was real. Even architecture reflected beliefs about sleep. Beds were often shared, not just between spouses but among siblings, servants, or guests. Privacy was minimal. Bed curtains were used for warmth and modesty. In wealthier homes, canopy beds became symbols of luxury. In poorer homes, pallets of straw or corn husks sufficed. The floor was fair game. Sleeping in shifts was common, especially in larger households. Some people worked at night, bakers, midwives, guardians slept in patches. Others stayed awake by the fire to keep it alive until morning. As you lie now under a quilt, stitched from scraps of old clothes, listening to the soft rustle of mice in the rafters and the faint creak of timbers in the wind, you know that sleep is near. You do not dread it, you do not rush it. You welcome it as the closing of a chapter. You pray, you breathe, you drift. In your dream, perhaps you are in your childhood home, or on a ship at sea, or standing in a green field where your grandmother calls your name. You know, even in the dream, that this is not real, but it feels real. And in the morning you will wake and carry its weight in your chest, unsure of what it meant, but sure that it meant something. Because in colonial America, as in your own time, The world of dreams was never dismissed. It was studied, feared, loved, and it was believed. Colonial timekeeping, how people measured hours without clocks. You wake before the sun, not because an alarm rang beside your bed, but because your body has learned the rhythms of light, the cues of birdsong, the subtle creak of floorboards beneath, neighbors rising early. Time in colonial America is not divided by minutes or seconds. It is marked instead by shadows, bells, and the behavior of animals. To live in this world is to live with time as a feeling, not as a ticking mechanical certainty. In the colonies, clocks are rare, expensive, and often unreliable. The average person doesn't own one. Even in towns, there may be only one or two public timepieces, usually mounted on a church tower or town hall, and they chime hours unevenly, sometimes several minutes off from one another. Most colonists rely on simpler cues: the position of the sun, the crow of the rooster, the toll of a bell, or the number of candles burned since supper. And so, you wake, dress, and begin your chores, guided not by numbers but by familiarity. The morning smell of bread rising tells you it's time to start grinding corn. The third call of the church bell, used to summon townsfolk, means the preacher is already approaching the pulpit. You know when it's noon, not because a watch ticks, but because your stomach growls and the light from the window falls just right across the floorboards. For most people in rural areas, the sun is the ultimate authority. Sun up to sundown is not a poetic phrase, it is law. The day begins with first light and ends when the shadows stretch too long to ignore. Farmers observe the sky to predict weather, track the seasons, and schedule planting or harvest. They know what time it is when the dew lifts or when the oxen low. Third light might refer to the third visible beam after dawn. Cock crow is a commonly used measurement. First cock crow, second cock crow. These are all cues, not fixed moments. Time flows like a river, not like a metronome. Water clocks exist, but they're limited. Hourglasses are more common in wealthier homes, especially among clergy or merchants. Made of blown glass and filled with sand, these devices measure approximate spans, often 15 minutes or an hour. They're used for sermons, baking, or measuring medicine intervals, but they're delicate and expensive. A broken hourglass means no more baking at precise times, only guesses and instincts. Some towns have noon marks, simple carvings or sundials placed on south-facing walls. When the shadow of a nail or iron bar hits the carved line, it's noon. In certain places, children are taught to observe these marks as a sort of informal school bell, but even sundials have their limits. Cloudy days confuse everything, and in winter, with shortened days, people recalibrate mentally. Long dark replaces evening. Lamplight is a time. First candle might mean the earliest time candles are needed, roughly around 5 p.m. in midwinter. Candle clocks also emerge where the time it takes a candle to burn a certain length serves as a marker. If 1 inch burns in 30 minutes, you can use it to measure time after sunset. Candles are marked with lines or pins that drop into a metal tray when they melt, but again, this is approximate. A drafty room or poorly made tallow can throw everything off. In larger towns like Boston or Philadelphia, bells are the primary public timekeepers. The town crier might announce the hour, or the church bell might ring once for each hour past midnight. But even this is inconsistent. Bell ringers make mistakes. Clappers get stuck. Bells are used for multiple purposes: funerals, court sessions, sermons, market openings, so one must listen carefully to distinguish which ring means what. And at night, many towns have a night watch who calls the hour aloud as they patrol. 2 of the clock and all as well might be shouted outside your window, reminding you of both time and safety. It's oddly reassuring, hearing another human voice affirm that the world is still turning. Inside the home, time is often measured by routine. You light a fire at a certain chill in the air, not at a specific time. You churn butter after the milking is done, not at 9 a.m. sharp. You eat when the chores allow it. Children learn the stages of the day by what they're told to do. After we feed the chickens, then we fetch water. Time is measured in actions. You don't ask what time is it. You ask, has the bread cooled yet? Or is the preacher still at it? Or has the sun passed the tall pine? Calendars are owned mostly by those who can read and afford them: merchants, ministers, or wealthy farmers. Almanacs are wildly popular. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac offers weather predictions, moral sayings, tide charts, moon phases, and planting advice. It's as close as many people get to a schedule. Some families hang them in the kitchen or tack pages to the wall. But even without printed calendars, people still track time. They know it by the moon's phase, by saints' days, by anniversaries of births, marriages, and deaths. Seasons are felt in the body-aching joints in spring, dry hands in fall. Holidays are fixed by community rather than date. The Sunday before planting might become an annual gathering. The full moon after the frost is how you schedule a slaughter. Religious time is deeply woven into daily life. Morning prayer, evening devotion, Sabbath rest, these are all anchors. Time is spiritual. A day doesn't start when the clock says it does. It starts when you kneel. In Catholic communities, bells may mark the Angelus, a thrice daily prayer at dawn, noon, and dusk. In Protestant towns, sermons often run until the hourglass empties twice roughly 2 hours. Congregants know how much time has passed by how many grains have fallen, not by looking at a pocket watch. And speaking of pocket watches use, they exist, but they are luxury items, imported from England, Switzerland, or France, often unreliable and incredibly costly. Only the wealthy carry them, and even then they are more about display than accuracy. A gentleman might pull out a watch at a gathering not to check the time, but to impress others. "Ah, nearly noon," he might say with a flourish, though the sun outside suggests otherwise. In enslaved communities, timekeeping is even more complex. Field labor is dictated by the overseer's call, by the position of the sun, or by the end of a task. There are no clocks in slave quarters, yet within these constraints people build their own sense of time. Songs are sung with verses to measure, hoe strokes. Spirituals might be timed to walking or planting. The rhythm of work becomes the clock, and in secret, people gather by moonlight, time chosen by instinct, by trust, by the feeling that now is right. Even storytelling has a timing. Grandparents wait for the second sleep, the middle of the night waking period when children are still drowsy and open, to tell tales of Africa, of escape, of hope. Colonial time is also social. Market day is whenever the traders arrive. A party begins after supper and ends when the cider runs out. A court case starts when the judge arrives, not when a clerk calls 9 a.m. sharp. Weddings happen at high sun. Funerals follow the toll of a bell and the arrival of neighbors. In this world, waiting is normal. Delays are expected. The concept of being late exists but is flexible. Punctuality is praised, but not rigid. Travel takes days, sometimes weeks. Mail arrives when it does. News spreads at the pace of horses and riverboats, but don't be fooled. Just because colonists lacked clocks doesn't mean they lacked discipline. A baker rises precisely at first light. A miller knows when to open the sluice by listening to the creek's flow. A teacher dismisses class when the shadow on the floor crosses the room. A mother rocks a baby until the second candle burns halfway. Time is embedded in life, not imposed on it. You sleep when the animals quiet down. You wake when the birds do. You harvest when the moon tells you to. You rest when the church bells say so. As you lie down tonight, your window open to a sky unspoiled by electric lights, and you hear the distant howl of a dog, the rustle of branches, and perhaps even the faint voice of a watchman calling the hour. You realize something remarkable. Though you haven't seen a single clock today, you know exactly what time it is. Not in minutes or digits, but in feeling, in scent, in rhythm. The bread is cooling, the fire is dimming. The stars are overhead, and you, like everyone else in this world, know that the time for sleep has arrived, not because of a mechanical signal, but because the night itself has told you so. Colonial weather, how people predicted, endured, and talked about the sky before the weather app, before the nightly forecast, before even the telegram that carried storm warnings across long distances. There was only the sky itself, watched, studied, and feared. In colonial America, you did not casually check the weather. You lived under it. You were constantly aware of its mood, its changes, its quiet threats. A sudden shift in wind direction wasn't just interesting, it could mean the difference between a harvest and a famine. The smell of the air, the way chickens settled in their coop early, or how the leaves turned their undersides to the breeze. What this meant something. Your body often knew before your brain did. Joints ached, noses itched, hair stood on end. The weather was not background, it was life's great conductor. And because there were no scientific instruments in the hands of most people, weather was read like a poem passed down through centuries, full of metaphor and memory, and above all, urgency. Step outside in midsummer, somewhere near the Connecticut River, and you will feel it immediately. The sun doesn't just shine, it presses. The humidity wraps around your clothes and refuses to let go. The insects are louder. The dogs pant earlier in the day. And when you hear the sudden silence of birds and see the tall grasses flatten, in a gust that comes from nowhere, you know it's time to run inside. Thunderstorms in colonial America were more than inconveniences, they were terrifying. With no grounding rods or lightning conductors in the early decades, a bolt from the sky could split your chimney, set your roof ablaze, kill livestock, or worse. Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment in 1752 eventually gave rise to the lightning rod, and churches, barns, and homes slowly adopted it. But before that, a lightning storm was seen as divine judgment. Bells were sometimes rung to break storm clouds, based on old European superstition. People prayed aloud during storms. Children were told to be still, not to provoke the thunder. And if your home was struck, you might spend years believing it meant something beyond physics or drought. On the other hand, arrived slowly, cruelly. Each week the grass browned a little more, wells dipped lower, creek beds cracked, crops curled in on themselves. A summer drought in colonial New England could destroy an entire community's food supply. Rain dances and prayers were common, especially among indigenous and African-descended communities who had long traditions of appealing to the elements through ritual. European settlers, too, held days of fasting and prayer to ask God for rain. Ministers would thunder from the pulpit about sins causing the sky to close. Some claimed tobacco crops were drying because of pride. Others blamed Sabbath breaking, but always, the weather was personal. It mirrored your morality. It was not a neutral system, it had intention. Winter, perhaps more than any other season, tested colonists' strength. Snow in modern times is beautiful. In colonial America, it could be lethal. Without modern heating, insulation, or reliable transportation, a deep snow could trap a family for days or even weeks. Roads became impassable. Horses collapsed in drifts. Feet froze through leather boots. Firewood had to be split every day. If your stockpile was too small, you might burn your furniture. You wore everything you owned. Babies were wrapped in blankets made from old coats. Entire households huddled in one room. Curtains drawn around the bed. Hot bricks tucked under blankets to keep frostbite at bay. Ice formed on the insides of windows. The water bucket froze solid by morning. And yet, even here, weather had its comforts. Families told stories around the fire. Children skated on frozen ponds. Meat could be stored outdoors, safe from spoilage. Snow reflected moonlight, giving winter nights a ghostly beauty. Spring was not always joyful. It brought flooding, mud, and disease. As snow melted and rivers swelled, homes near banks were sometimes washed away. Chickens drowned in their coops. Fields became swamps. Rot spread fast. Spring was planting season, yes, but also cleanup season. Dead animals buried under snow emerged. Roofs damaged by ice leaked. Rain came in sheets, sometimes for days. But people also celebrated the signs: crocuses pushing through soil, frogs singing at night, the return of birds. Almanacs were consulted obsessively during this time. When should you plant your beans? When would the last frost come? Plant peas by the full moon, some said. Others watched oak leaves when the oak leaf is the size of a mouse's ear. Plant your corn. These were not random sayings. They were born of observation, trial, and ancestral memory. And when predictions failed, people didn't curse science, they looked inward. Fall was perhaps the most beloved season in the colonies. Cool nights, crisp air, and the blaze of red and orange in the trees brought relief after summer's labors. It was a season of abundance, of cider pressing, corn husking, and harvest dances. Weather in fall was still unpredictable, but its mood was gentler. The wind told stories. Fires crackled with purpose. Women dried herbs in the kitchen, their scents mingling with wood smoke. Hunters tracked deer in the thinning woods, and every breeze carried the promise of something important, a reminder that time was moving, that change was both necessary and natural. Storms at sea, however, were another matter entirely. If you were a sailor, a merchant, or even a passenger crossing the Atlantic, the weather was your greatest threat. Hurricanes could obliterate a ship in hours. Sudden squalls tore sails and snapped masts. Colonists along the coast watched the horizon nervously, knowing that if the sky darkened the wrong way, it might mean not only lost goods, but lost lives. Ships delayed by storms might mean a town went without sugar, or without news from England, for months. The sea and the sky were bound together. The clouds you saw inland might be remnants of chaos hundreds of miles away. There were other weather phenomena, too, that captivated and frightened. Ball lightning, reported on rare occasions, was considered supernatural. Hailstorms the size of goose eggs shattered windows. Heat waves caused mass fainting at church. And the 1816 year without a summer, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora on the other side of the world, led to June snowfalls and failed crops across New England. People had no idea why it was happening. Some believed the apocalypse had come. Others wrote poetry about the sunless sky and the eternal frost. Colonial people didn't have meteorology, but they had awe. The weather was a creature, a god, a punishment, a mystery. To cope, they talked letters full of weather reports. My dear sister, the rain has not stopped for 4 days. Or the wind last night howled like judgment. Diaries recorded not only temperatures and storms, but their emotional weight. Felt a chill in my bones. Today fear it may bring ague, or the heat is such that the cows refuse to give milk. Neighbors exchanged weather lore. If the rooster crows at night, expect wind by morning. A ring around the moon. Rain in 3 days. Spiderwebs thicken the grass. Mean frost is coming. And remarkably, many of these sayings were accurate because they were rooted in centuries of close observation. Even clothing was chosen with weather in mind. Long before waterproof fabrics or thermal insulation, oilskin cloaks, waxed hats, layers of wool and linen. Children wore mittens tied to their sleeves. Women wrapped shawls over bonnets. Men placed hot stones in their pockets to warm fingers. If caught in a storm, you didn't run, you ducked under a tree or into a neighbor's barn and waited. Getting wet wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be dangerous. Pneumonia was deadly. Drying clothes was labor. Every decision, from your shoes to your route to your menu, was dictated by the sky. And at night, as you lie in bed, the fire dying, the wind tapping gently at the shutters, you think of the sky as something alive. You say a prayer for dry weather tomorrow, or for rain if the well is low. You wonder if the cold will keep. You remember your father's saying, if the sunset is red, the morning will be dry. You listen to the wind, trying to guess its direction. Maybe it brings snow, maybe it brings peace. In this world you never forget the weather, because it never forgets you. Colonial food preservation. How people kept things from rotting without refrigerators, in a time before refrigerators, iceboxes, vacuum sealing, or even reliable glass jars. Preserving food in colonial America wasn't just a task, it was a full-time, year-round battle against rot, mold, maggots and mice. Without modern conveniences, the very idea of keeping something fresh for longer than a few days required strategy, inherited wisdom, and backbreaking labor. To live in the colonies was to constantly work not just for today's meals, but to prepare for the long, lean days ahead. Every harvest, every butchering, every batch of berries had to be considered in terms of survival, because when the snow fell and the roads vanished, or when the summer heat spoiled everything within hours, the question wasn't what you wanted to eat, it was what you had managed to save. And so, colonial food preservation wasn't an afterthought, it was an obsession. It was a kind of daily magic performed with smoke, salt, fire, sun, and hope. To open a barrel in February and find good meat or unspoiled apples was a small miracle, one that someone, probably a woman with cracked hands and a sore back, had worked hard to secure months before. Let's start with meat, because few things spoil faster or smell worse. When an animal was slaughtered, be it a hog, a cow, a goose, or even a squirrel, it had to be processed immediately. There was no time to waste. In colder months, this task was easier. Butchering days were often scheduled for late fall or early winter, when nature itself helped keep the carcass cold. But in warmer weather, speed was vital. Meat was salted, rubbed vigorously with coarse salt until it soaked through the flesh, and then packed into barrels with even more salt. This method, known as dry curing, drew out moisture and created an environment inhospitable to bacteria. For added preservation, some meats were smoked after salting. Smokehouses, small wooden sheds with no windows, became common in many towns and on farms. A fire would be kept smoldering inside for days, coating hams, fish, or sausages with layers of smoke that helped dehydrate the meat and imparted both flavor and resistance to the entire structure would be steeped in the smell of hickory or applewood. Even children's clothes hung too near the building would come away reeking of fire and salt. Fish, a staple near coastal and river communities, was treated much the same. Cod was salted and dried on wooden racks in the sun until it became stiff as a board. Shad might be smoked or pickled. Oysters were preserved in brine. Shellfish were risky, they had to be eaten fresh or kept alive in barrels of seawater. Spoiled shellfish meant death. Colonists learned this quickly, often the hard way. Pickling became another key technique. Cucumbers, onions, beans, and even fruits like peaches or watermelon rinds were submerged in vinegar, often spiced with mustard seed, dill, cloves, or peppercorns. Pickled items were kept in ceramic crocks or wooden barrels and stored in cool cellars. Vinegar itself was precious. Many families brewed their own from spoiled wine or cider, carefully nurturing the mother culture that turned alcohol sour. The pickles of colonial America were not the sweet, crunchy snacks we know today. They were aggressively sour, heavily spiced, and considered essential to digestion. A bite of pickle was believed to help balance a heavy meal. Some people even drank vinegar water on purpose. Fruits were dried, especially apples and peaches. Sliced thin, they were laid on screens or strung up with thread and hung in the rafters, away from flies. Sun-dried fruits became leathery, chewy, and shrank considerably, but they could last months if kept dry. These were often rehydrated later, in stews or pies. Raisins were made from grapes and stored in clay jars. Fruit butters and jams existed, but the sugar needed to make them was costly and rare. In New England especially, colonists relied on boiled-down apple cider or maple syrup for sweeteners. Cider was reduced to a thick concentrate called apple molasses, used to flavor breads or preserve fruits. Speaking of cider, it too was preserved, usually by fermentation. Hard cider was the drink of choice for many colonists, safer than untreated water and capable of being stored in wooden barrels for months. Even children drank watered-down cider. If it turned sour, it became vinegar. Nothing was wasted. Dairy was perhaps the most delicate and short-lived food group. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled quickly, so it was almost always transformed into something else, usually butter or cheese. Butter was churned and then packed tightly into crocks or wooden molds, topped with a layer of salt or water to keep air out. It was then stored in the coolest part of the house, if in a spring house or cellar. Cheese was pressed, salted, and aged on wooden shelves. Soft cheeses had to be eaten quickly. Hard cheeses, especially cheddar, could last months or longer. The smell of cheese curing in a cellar was pungent, earthy, and strong enough to scare off mice, though that rarely worked. Rodents were a constant threat to preserved food. Pantries were built high. Barrels were sealed with wax or cloth soaked in animal fat. Some people kept cats solely for their ability to guard the food stores. Grains and flours were stored in barrels, but they were vulnerable to moisture, insects, and rodents. Flour could go rancid. Cornmeal spoiled easily if not kept dry. To prevent this, some families stored grains in cloth sacks hung from rafters, or in wooden bins rubbed with lye or vinegar to repel pests. Rice was imported and expensive. Oats and barley were common. Bread was baked daily when possible, but in lean seasons, people ate journey cakes or ash cakes made from cornmeal and water, cooked on hot stones. These could last a few days and were often packed for travel. Molasses, syrup, and honey were precious sweeteners that lasted if protected from air and moisture. Honey, in particular, never spoils. Some colonists kept bees, harvesting wax for candles and honey for medicine, baking, and sweet drinks. A spoonful of honey in herbal tea was a luxury. Fermentation was not just a preservation method but a way of life. Vegetables were fermented into kraut. Cabbage was chopped, salted, and packed into crocks, then weighted with stones. The resulting sauerkraut lasted all winter and provided crucial vitamins. Colonists who skipped it often developed scurvy. Root cellars were built partially underground to take advantage of stable, cool temperatures. There, potatoes, turnips, carrots, and squash were layered in sand or straw to keep them from freezing or sprouting. Apples and pears were wrapped in paper and stored in wooden bins. You could walk into a well-managed cellar in January and find a pumpkin, shriveled but intact, waiting to be eaten. Eggs, too, could be preserved. In summer, when chickens laid daily, extra eggs were stored in lime water and alkaline solution that sealed the shells and prevented spoilage. These eggs could last months. Other methods included packing eggs in salt or burying them in bran. None were foolproof. Opening a spoiled egg was a gamble. The smell could drive a person from the room. Still, every method had its risks. Sometimes entire barrels spoiled. Mold ruined cheese. Pickles went soft. Insects bored into flour. A mouse in the butter crock meant days of hunger. People adapted. They planned for failure. They made extra, stored it in separate places, and shared techniques with neighbors. Community knowledge was vital. If a woman discovered a better way to keep beans dry, or a method for keeping weevils out of grain, she passed it along. Preservation tips were exchanged like recipes, sometimes sung as rhymes. Layer your apples, straw between, else they'll rot and smell unclean. Children learned early how to help. Stirring vinegar, drying herbs, watching the smokehouse door. Everyone contributed. In towns, some food was preserved in public facilities, communal ovens, shared smokehouses, or large dairies. In rural areas, each family fended for themselves. Preserving food wasn't just about technique, it shaped how people ate. Meals were based on what was available. In winter, you ate beans, dried apples, salted pork, and root vegetables. In spring, you might finally have eggs, fresh greens, or milk. Summer brought bounty, but also urgency. Everything had to be processed quickly. By fall, you were surrounded by full barrels, jars, and sacks, but always with the awareness that it could all vanish with one mold bloom or a rodent invasion. And so, as night fell and candles flickered in kitchens across the colonies, you might hear the scrape of a lid, the clink of a jar, the careful tap of a crock being sealed, a sigh of relief, another meal saved for another day. As you settle into bed now, belly full of pickled beans and a slice of bread spread with apple butter, you smell the faint tang of vinegar in the air. You remember the careful hands that salted the meat, the long hours spent churning butter, the whispered prayers offered over a cellar door. Because in this world, food was sacred not just when it was eaten but when it was preserved. And every bite you take tomorrow was a gift prepared months before. You sleep knowing the pantry is full for now. Colonial hygiene, what cleanliness meant when baths were rare and soap was homemaking. Imagine yourself waking up in a modest colonial home. The first thing you notice isn't a mirror or a faucet, it's the smell. Wood smoke, earth, wool, sweat, and maybe a trace of something sour. You stretch beneath your coarse linen sheets and realize that whatever filth you brought to bed with you last night, dust from the field, soot from the kitchen, grease from the lantern, is still with you. In colonial America, cleanliness was not about sparkle or scent the way we understand it today. It was about practicality, health, religion, and, in some cases, sheer survival. But the idea of hygiene didn't mean daily showers, toothbrushes, or a drawer full of fresh underwear. In fact, you might go weeks without a full body bath, yet you wouldn't necessarily be considered dirty, because being clean in this era meant something else entirely. Let's start with bathing, or rather, the near absence of it. Full immersion baths were rare, partly due to lack of plumbing and heated water, but also because many believed bathing too often could make you sick. The logic was this: opening your pores with hot water made you vulnerable to bad air, or miasma, which was thought to cause disease. In Europe, this belief had already taken root for centuries, and colonists brought it with them across the ocean. Instead of bathing regularly, people cleaned themselves with washcloths, often called flannels or rags. Each morning you might wipe your face, hands, neck, and armpits with cool water from a basin poured from a pitcher onto a bowl. This was known as a partial wash, and for many, it was the most cleansing they'd get all week. In wealthier homes, this ritual took place in a bedroom equipped with a washstand and mirror. In poorer homes, it happened wherever you could find space, often in the kitchen or outdoors. You dried yourself with a coarse linen towel and got dressed, usually in the same underclothes you wore yesterday and the day before. As for full baths, when they did occur, they were elaborate events. Water had to be hauled from a well or spring, heated in heavy iron pots, and poured into a wooden tub, often the only one the household owned. Families might take turns using the same water, beginning with the oldest or most important member. Soap, if available, was homemade, usually a harsh, lye-based concoction that stung the eyes and dried the skin. It was used sparingly. Scented soaps were rare luxuries, imported at great cost. Children dreaded bath day because of the stinging soap, the cold rinse, and the boredom of waiting their turn. In some towns, public bathhouses existed, but they were few and far between. By and large, bathing was seasonal or event. You washed fully before a wedding, or a funeral, or when lice got truly unbearable. Lice and fleas and bedbugs, they were everywhere. Combating them was a constant struggle. Combs were used not just for styling hair but for scraping out nits. Women often kept fine-tooth combs tucked in their bodices. Hair was rarely washed, maybe a few times a year, because it